Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmidt, and today I'm answering your questions from the AMA, the 3K AMA for 3K subs. I know a lot of you watched that video and left a comment or a question, and so I really appreciate it. Once again, thank you all for 3K, and I couldn't do it without you guys. So let's get into the questions. Venerage asks, your top 3 books, movies, and movie characters. Okay, so books, I mean, obviously, my book is the #1 book. Oh, no, I pointed the wrong way. I'm just kidding. So I mainly read philosophy books, so I'm kind of like an uncultured swine here, but probably the first one is Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. I really enjoyed that. The second book that I'll say is Alexander Pruse's Principle of Sufficient Reason, A Reassessment. I just love that book because it's just a tour de force in just analytic metaphysics and intersection of metaphysics and causation and philosophy of religion, and it's written really well, and it's one of the first philosophy, like proper philosophy books that I read, and it awakened me from my dogmatic slumbers, to quote Immanuel Kant with respect to Hume. So the third one that I'll say is actually behind me. So it's right there. Yeah, The Atlas of Reality, A Comprehensive Guide to Metaphysics. That's by Rob Coons and Tim Pickavance. It's just amazing. It covers all sorts of different topics in metaphysics. It's a comprehensive guide. So I just absolutely love it, and I have it in a hardback, and I got it for Christmas, and so it means a lot to me. I'm going to answer some other books and whatnot later, so because people ask similar questions. I'm not a movie buff, unfortunately, so I know you said movies and movie characters. I don't watch many. But my top 2, obviously, are going to be God's Not Dead and God's Not Dead 2. Okay, so getting serious, I'm only going to give my favorite movie and movie character mainly because I don't know enough to have others. So I watched back in 2016 when it came out, the movie Arrival, and I thought it was so interesting. And then movie character, I have to say Joker from the Joker movie, right? You have to love a villain, especially when it's combined with really good acting. Blamtasticful says, congrats, what is your take on the minimal facts argument for the resurrection as presented by Lacona and Habermas? Do you think it successfully infers that the resurrection is the best explanation for the historical data? So I haven't studied the literature on historical apologetics all that much, so unfortunately I can't quite comment on this in any depth. I like to emphasize the importance of saying, like, I don't know, or I haven't researched this enough, right? When I, like, genuinely don't know something, or I genuinely haven't taken enough time and effort to research it, to get a firm view. With those requisite points about my intellectual limitations out of the way, I am inclined to think that justifying God's existence is probably going to be foundational for mounting such a successful probabilistic resurrection case. And as you can tell, I'm still stuck, as it were, on that step of whether God exists in the first place. So in other words, I'm inclined to think that without God's existence having been justified, the relevant Bayes factor will be insufficient to overturn the prior improbability of the hypothesis that Jesus was raised from the dead, or that God raised Jesus from the dead, or whatever. But again, I claim no expertise here, and I would need much more research on my part to come to a kind of firm, settled view. So, okay, Tam Chris says, you deserve 3 million, man. Okay, thank you so much. I do appreciate that. Jeremy asks, what is your favorite TV series? So, unfortunately, I don't watch TV. I think I stopped watching it maybe in freshman year of high school or something like that. But when I did watch TV, I think my favorite show was probably Big Bang Theory back in freshman year of high school. Computer Theist asks, do you plan to interview Dr. Rob Coons or Dr. Nujin Nagasawa? So, okay, while I would love to interview Nujin, the dude's like a superstar in the world of philosophy, right? Or at least philosophy of religion. So he's really hard to get a hold of. And so I don't think I'll be interviewing him. And then as for Rob Coons, as you probably know, I have had him on my channel at least 2 times, one with Oppie and another with Ryan Mullins. And I hope to get him on again. Logos Theos asks, Elephant Philosophy's channel is down, and so I've come here to satisfy my philosophy of religion crack addiction. So I love to hear that, yes. I love to satisfy people's crack addiction. By the way, everyone, some other people were asking about Elephant Philosophy and so on. So he's fine and happy. He just needs a break from all the chaos of YouTube and social media and whatnot. I still chat with him. I know that he won't be back on the platform anytime soon. He is taking his break seriously. But I also know that there's a chance after some time, an unspecifiable amount of time, it's not soon, but some unspecifiable amount of time, that he'll probably be rejuvenated and come back. But that's probably in the far future. Yeah, don't get your hopes too much up. But, happy that he's, safe, healthy, fine, happy, and relaxing. Taking a rejuvenation from the cringe and chaos of the internet world. All right, Chloopy Chlupa asks, what a name. My question is about the Munchausen trilemma. Do you feel the regressive branch and the circular branch are receiving much more criticism than the axiomatic branch? That's what it seems like to me, and I'd like your thoughts on the trilemma and the reasons for this presumed inequality between the three branches. Thanks for your work. Well, thank you for your comment and for appreciating my work. Agrippa's trilemma, or sometimes people call it the Munchausen trilemma or whatever. I don't quite know how to pronounce that in German. It's basically three alternatives regarding the structure of justification. The trilemma is basically like, hey, we have a lot of beliefs. These beliefs are either unsupported or we'll just pick one belief. That belief is either unsupported, or if it's supported, we can ask, like, okay, well, that belief that it's supported by, is that supported? Well, it's either unsupported or is it self-supported? And you can see where we're going with this, right? So then either we have a kind of infinite chain of justification supporting that initial belief, or this chain is somehow going to have to circle back up on itself, and one of the beliefs is, as it were, just going to have to justify itself, whether directly or indirectly. These are pretty bleak alternatives, right? Because either our beliefs are going to be unjustified, or we just seem to infinitely defer their justification, which is hard to see how they could be justified then, if we just have this infinite chain that's ungrounded without bottoming out in something. Or something pulls itself up by its own bootstraps, like somehow it justifies itself. It seems to be circular reasoning. It's like saying that God exists because the Bible says so, and the Bible is true because God exists to ensure that it's true. You know, it's like that kind of circular reasoning. So it does look like a pretty severe trilemma. Now, the three epistemological responses to Agrippa's trilemma are infinitism, so the view that roughly the structure of our justification does have that kind of infinitely descending chain of justifications. Coherentism, where we kind of have this interlocking web or system of beliefs, and it doesn't go down infinitely, but it also doesn't bottom out in some kind of foundational unsupported beliefs, but rather you kind of have this interlocking web, so there are these kinds of circles of justification. And finally, foundationalism, which says you kind of bottom out in certain beliefs that are not supported by further beliefs or what have you. My general sense is that there's less discussion of the infinitism and coherentism branches and more discussion of the foundationalism branch. I think that might be because a lot of people just don't find, even philosophers, they don't find infinitism and coherentism all that plausible. I mean, coherentism, a lot of people don't think that we could ultimately have beliefs justified if they're circularly justified. And moreover, a lot of philosophers think that either we can't have infinitely many beliefs, or if we do, it's hard to see how you could have justification in that case, because you're just infinitely deferring justification, or so it seems. And now, I myself am a foundationalist, so, you know, that's my cards on the table, but I've probably already spent enough time on this this question, but I do appreciate your question, so thank you. So, JJ Nan asks, can we see your bookshelf? Oh, goodness. Yes, so I'll show you it. I'll show you the ones that I have down here. I have some ones upstairs as well, but I'm too lazy to go up there. 99% of my books are online, so we're just going to have to make do with what I'm going to show you here. So let's go through it. All right, so I'm literally holding my camera in my hand right now, but I'm going to do a book tour for you guys. So these are all my physical books. Like I said, I only, like 99% of my books and whatnot is on my computer. 99% of my books are on my computer or is on my computer. 99%, see, of my books, but that's in the prepositional phrase. Okay, I need to stop. I'm just going to show you the books. Anyway, well, before I do that, my friend Esteban is actually running accounts for me on social media now, so like you can follow my page on Facebook, Majesty of Reason, and Instagram and Twitter. I don't like social media all that much. I do use Facebook, but other than that, I don't really use it. But so check out those if you're interested. And also, if you like free content in philosophy, consider supporting me on Patreon. I'm just going to do that before the book tour. It looks like I'm looking up, but I'm just looking at my computer because I have this in my hands. Anyway, we're just going to do the book tour. So we're going to look down here. So here we got A History of Philosophy by Frederick Coppelston. Volume 1, Rome and Greece. Oh, these are the ones that aren't on my bookshelf. Another History of Philosophy. So this is Frederick Coppelston, S.J., means he's a liberal. No, I'm kidding. Okay, so Volume 4, Descartes to Leibniz. This has also Volume 5, Hobbes to Hume, and Volume 6, Wolff to Kant. Okay. So, oh, there's The Majesty of Reason. This is a good book. This is a good book. There are a couple spelling errors, so the editor should be fired. I was the editor. Here, Who Designed the Designer? A Rediscovered Path to God's Existence. That's by Michael Agros. He's a Thomistic philosopher. Das Heilige, The Idea of the Holy. Oh, man, sorry, I'm not getting on camera. But yeah, Das Heilige, The Idea of the Holy by Rudolf Otto. This is one of Paul Draper's favorite books. We had to read it for one of his philosophy of religion classes. It was like Philosophy 406 or something. Talks about the numinous and numinous experiences and different religious experiences and so on. So it's really interesting. This is just a copy that I'm probably going to be giving out to patrons, so I'm probably going to do a book giveaway at some point. Teresa Vavilla, the book of her life. She talks about a bunch of her different mystical experiences that she experienced in this. So we had to talk about the phenomenology and evidential significance of religious experience in our class on philosophy of religion with Paul Draper. So I've got Al-Ghazali, if you're William Lane Craig, on Knowing Yourself and God. So here in Aristotelian Realist Philosophy of Mathematics, Mathematics as the Science of Quantity and Structure by James Franklin. That's a pretty sexy title. It's a pretty sexy cover page, if you ask me. Okay, a philosophical critique of empirical arguments for postmortem survival by Michael Sudduth. Looks at the evidential significance of near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, and so on, and he gives a more philosophical critique of these empirical arguments for the afterlife and so on. This one's actually my dad's, so I don't have this one. I haven't read it, but it's called How to Think Like Aquinas, the Sure Way to Perfect Your Mental Powers. It looks interesting. I should probably read it at some point. But you guys know that I love like thinking critically and like how to think instead of like, you know, just telling you, hey, you have to think this or what to think. Okay, I recommended these on my my video. What is philosophy? I absolutely love this. Philosophy 1, a guide through the subject, edited by A.C. Grayling. It's truly brilliant, and it's accompanying Philosophy 2, further through the subject. So they have all sorts of things on philosophy of religion, philosophy of language, philosophy of science, ancient philosophy. It's just brilliant. And these are thick, like 8 C's thick. Examining Schellenberg's Hiddenness Argument by Veronica Widener. Very interesting. Okay, and then the famous Metaphysics, A Contemporary Introduction, the 4th edition by Lux and Crisp. Famous because, yeah, this is what's taught in, like, most... Well, this book is usually used in metaphysics classes. Excellent. Mwah. Okay, Augustine, On Free Choice of the Will. This was a fun read. I think he has, like, an ode to truth in here that I absolutely adore. It's one of the reasons why Augustine is one of my favorite medieval thinkers. Peter Berger, The Sacred Canopy, The Social Construction of Reality. So... I only read the first chapter of this. I had to do this for one of my electives. It was like a religion studies elective, so it's not really philosophy, but... Okay, Gavin Kerr, Aquinas. I know some people say Kerr, so please don't kill me, but this is Gavin Kerr's Aquinas and the Metaphysics of Creation. It is a sequel to his Aquinas' Way to God, Gavin Kerr, The Proof in the Deante Essentia, or Essentia. Yeah, if you guys want to hear me talk about the Deante argument, you can look at my part 1 of Arguments for Classical Theism video. I talk a lot about the Dante argument, and I quote both of these books rather heavily, so I had to read this for that class. It's called The Sacred and the Profane. This is Marcia Eliade. Anselm's Proslogion, you know, you can't go wrong with that. No, he gives both of his ontological arguments, and I think some people even argue that there's a third in there, but Edward Feser, Aristotle's Revenge, The Metaphysical Foundations of Physical and Biological Science. This one is Sleight of Mind, 75 Ingenious Paradoxes in Mathematics, Physics, and Philosophy. This is an amazing book. It's kind of like Michael Huemer's Paradox Lost, so it's really fun. And it explains it really, really well. This one is by Louis Vaughan, yeah. So this is Writing Philosophy, A Student's Guide to Reading and Writing Philosophy Essays, so I recommend it you peeps who want to be able to write clearly and precisely and whatnot. Could there have been nothing against metaphysical nihilism, the view that there's a possible world in which absolutely nothing exists. So here I've got Joseph Piper, I think, Only the Lover Sings, Art and Contemplation, and I've got a bunch of different math contest books for high school and whatnot. I really like math, so I used to get math contest books for fun because I was in the math league, and yeah, I'm just a nerd, but I love them, so you're just going to have to deal with it. Bad Arguments, 100 of the Most Important Fallacies in Western Philosophy, Knowledge, Reality, and Value, a Mostly Common Sense Guide to Philosophy by Michael Huemer. I love this one. This is a book that I would add to that list of books that I recommend people read to get a good foundation in philosophy. In my video, What is Philosophy? Up here, this fell down when I was actually recording something. But that's The Problem of Animal Pain, A Theodicy for All Creatures Great and Small by Trent Doherty. Very interesting. Man, so stupid. Not the book, but it's falling down. There, Divine Omniscience and Human Free Will, A Logical and Metaphysical Analysis. This book I absolutely love. Actuality, Possibility, and Worlds by Alexander Pruss. Existence, Essays in Ontology by Peter Van Inwagen. The Atlas of Reality, A Comprehensive Guide to Metaphysics, Naming and Necessity by Saul Kripke. Change, The Arrow of Time, Divine Eternity, Light of Relativity Theory. Just the Arguments, 100 of the Most Important Arguments in Western Philosophy. Absolutely love this one. Got something from my Catholic high school stuff. Philosophy 101, just a popular book. What is this? A 21st Century Ethical Toolkit. Real Essentialism by David Oderberg. The Experience of Philosophy. It's just a bunch of readings in philosophy, so let me put this back up. Origins, so this is, I think, about reconciling the biblical account with evolution. The Elements of Style, if you guys want to be able to write well, read this. I haven't read the whole thing, I probably should. This is stuff, econ stuff that I had to read. Oh my goodness, Moonwalking with Einstein. This book kind of changed my life. Oh, I love this. The Art and Science of Remembering Everything. So this guy is like a memory champion, and he talks about memory techniques like the method of loci or whatever it is, and like memory palaces, and you can like memorize decks of cards. I'll talk some about that later because I employ some of that, but it's so amazing. Oh my goodness, you can like memorize thousands of digits of pi and everything. It's so cool. Oh, George Barclay. This is in my first video that I made on my channel. I made a joke. It's like, did you hear that George Barclay died? Yeah, his girlfriend stopped seeing him. But fun book. I think I probably marked it up a lot. Did I? Let's see. Oh, yeah, I did. Section 45, not an objection. Nice. The Visit. This was a kind of an interesting book. Neuroscience textbook, Exploring Evolution. This is a really good intro to evolution, as is, I don't know if I have Richard Dawkins' book, but you guys know that I'm not the biggest fan of Richard Dawkins, but his book on The Only Game in Town is a really good book with respect to the evidence for evolution and talking about it. It's such a good book. I highly recommend it. More precisely, The Math You Need to Do Philosophy by Eric Steinhardt. Mwah, love it. Let's see. The Incorruptibles, Eucharistic Miracles, The Language of God, The Ethics Toolkit. Hamlet is doing something there, so is Things Fall Apart, like Okonkwo, for those of you who read that. Okonkwo's my boy, even though he had a terrible ending. Philosophical Devices by David Papineau. I love this book, so good. How Reason Can Lead to God by Josh Rasmussen. Excellent little book there. I can't even see it. Oh, Joseph Schmid. There it goes. I don't know if you guys can even see this, but that's me. Okay, so that's me. It's me, Mario. Okay, so Plato's Problem: An Introduction to Mathematical Platonism. Over there, The Puzzle of Existence. Why is there something rather than nothing? Edited by Tyrone Goldschmidt. Rutledge Philosophy. That has some really good contributions in there by Oppie and others. And then James P. Sturba, Is a Good God Logically Possible? The logical argument from evil doesn't work, guys, but you know, he gives it a shot. I feel like a blogger. You know, like, hi guys, it's your old pal Cenable here. We need communism. Okay, so The Existence of God by Richard Swinburne. I don't know if I already said that. I think I just did this one and then I skipped up here, but and then Alvin Planning, The Nature of Necessity.
The probability of our cognitive faculties given naturalism and evolution is quite low.
Sorry, that was terrible. And then Richard Swinburne, that is to say. Oh yeah, and then up here I've got just my stylistic majesty reason. Philosophy of Time, A Contemporary Introduction. This was published in 2021. I actually pre-ordered it, just got it a couple of weeks back. 2 dozen or so arguments for God, and then Infinity, Causation, and Paradox by Alexander Cruz. There are more books that I have. I think they're like upstairs or something, but that's probably suffices for now. So I'm just going to get back to answering the questions. All right, Amos Wolin asks, I think that's how you pronounce it, what is your best impression we haven't heard? Oh man. So you guys who saw my Capturing Christianity discussion on the 3 biggest mistakes that atheists make, I did a Swinburne and Zizek impression. I guess I can do a kind of snobby British accent where it's like, oh yes, could you please pass the tea? Oh yes. You know, it's just like loser. There's also like, I could do a Dobby accent where it's like, Dobby not happy. I could do it much better, but I kind of want to skip. I don't want to spend too much time on impressions. Alright mate, I can also do Scottish, laddie. Alright mate, alright laddie. Okay, so that's Scottish. And then Irish, it's like, oh mate, Irish. That's moralism, Patrick. Jordan Peterson, let's see, I could probably do that one. It's like, so what you're saying is, women are not happy. That's not what I was saying. That is not what I was saying, right? All I was saying was that when women have a sort of domineering husband, okay, so they're not that good, but I do like I have a lot of others as well, but yeah, Swinburne and Zizek, those are fun. Ich pure capitalist ideology, and so on. Annette Kithera asks, congrats, now let's move that decimal place to the right by 1. Yeah, I hope. But, yeah, I mean, if I can serve one person, that'll make it all worth it, so. But thank you for your congratulations. Okay, so an Arabic name, I translated this in Google Translate. It says philosophical theology, apparently. So they ask, how did you get this good at soccer and why aren't you pursuing it professionally? So as you guys might have seen some of the soccer bonus soccer that I added at the end of my video with Alex Malpass. I recorded some more soccer things and I'm putting them at the end of 2 more videos that are coming out. One of them is on the philosophy of hypertime with Sam Liebens and Ryan Mullins. So I put some soccer there at the end. And then another one I put some soccer at the end of is Platonism and the Objects of Science with Dr. Scott Berman. And that one's probably going to be coming out, like 9 days after my Swinburn interview or whatever. Yeah, some more soccer coming. I'm not trying to brag, but I am quite good at soccer. I've played my whole life since I was like 3 at a really extremely competitive level. Like traveling all over the country from Vegas to Chicago to New Orleans and beyond. What positions did I play? I guess I could answer that. So I played center attacking mid. I played left wing and right wing. So positions that require a lot of dribbling and technicality. I also did like 3v3 a lot. So 3v3, it's like small-sided. And so that really developed my technical abilities, dribbling and whatnot, and skill moves and so on. And we actually went to nationals. So like you have to win something like state and then regionals and then like and then you get to go to the nationals. And our 3v3 team got like 5th or something in nationals. So we were like one of the best teams in the nation with respect to 3v3. So that was fun. As to why not pursuing it further. So actually 2 massive concussions I got in 2017 and in the early 2018. They were just really bad. They devastated my life, really. But, I'm mostly over them. There's a chance, I kid you not, that I would go on to D1 college soccer were it not for those head injuries. Yeah, I mean, I also love watching professional soccer. I watched it when I was younger religiously, so I can name like so many soccer teams and badges and players. So many, it's not healthy. Meow 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 asks, or they say, bring on Stephen Broad to discuss post-mortem survival before it gets too old. My answer is maybe. Maybe I'll be able to do that. We'll see. Yeah, I guess I'll plug the Philosophical Critique of Empirical Arguments for Postmortem Survival by Michael Scotus. William Porter asks, Arteta in or out? So my answer is Arteta in. So I say let him develop the players, especially people like Bukayo Saka and Emile Smith-Rowe. Primetime says, congrats. I say thank you. Love and Ideas asks, do you believe in God? So I'm an agnostic. Given the extensive research I've done, I think the evidence and arguments I've looked into, my credences in theism and naturalism roughly counterbalance one another, something like that. So check out my video on why am I an agnostic. Bronson Van asks, or says, congrats, Joe, you earned it. Thank you very much. Eric D asks, question for the AMA. What is your general study routine like? So a lot of you like this one. What is your general study routine like? And what is your writing routine like? And for both, what methods or apps or hacks do you use? How much time do you put in, and how do you ensure that it's high quality time? I love hearing what successful students are doing to get ideas for my own studies. I say it depends on the time of year as for how long I go. If it's in the school year, I mean, I'm mostly focusing on my classwork. But in the summer, my philosophy research becomes center stage. And of course, I also pay a lot more attention to the channel, Majesty of Reason. That's not to say that I ignore it during the school year. Obviously, I still post like once every 1 or 2 weeks. But over the summer, now it's like once a week. So, and the videos are like 2 hours long. So regarding the first thing that you asked about the study routine, my routine is based on 1, tasks, and 2, specific time-indexed goals. So regarding the first one, the tasks, so in the abstract, that basically means explicitly listing out all the tasks in my different areas of life that I have to do. Okay, so for instance, I'll have one area dedicated to social stuff, another dedicated to research, another dedicated to personal learning, another one dedicated to YouTube and social media, and another one dedicated to school. So on the social one, I might have some date that I need to hang out with friends on, or like weddings that I have to go to. I was just the best man in a wedding, family stuff that I have, and so on. On the research side, I'll have like papers that I need to read for my research. I'll have notes that I need to take. I'll have revise and resubmits from journals that I've gotten. I'll have papers that I'm writing that I need to work on, co-authored papers that I'm working on, papers that I review as an anonymous referee for other journals, and so on. So those are the tasks within that area. Personal learning tasks include papers that I read for fun, books that I read for fun, and so on. YouTube and social media, that would include, of course, things like interviews, scheduling, discussion briefs. Those are like things that I prepare in advance to send to the guest. Scripts, recording, editing, blog, emails. I hate emails. School, homework, classes, reading, applications, those sorts of things that fall under the school tab. So, and of course, in the background of all of this are just givens, right? So I exercise, things like exercise, health, relaxation, and so on. Anyway, so that's the first thing. My system has tasks, and the tasks are broken down into certain main areas like social, research, personal learning, and so on. And then regarding the second aspect of my routine, I just have specific time-indexed goals. So I'll take each of the tasks that I need to complete from the respective areas, and I'll assign a due date to them, as it were. So, for instance, I'll be like, okay, Monday, I have to read X article and take notes on it before I play soccer, and then I have to play soccer with a friend that I scheduled at 3 p.m., and then in the evening, I will complete the discussion brief for, let's say, the Sam Liebens, Ryan Mullins discussion. And so, like, that sort of thing. So I have the tasks, and I have a plan for what day I want to do them on, and generally what time I want to do them on. You need to build in flexibility and whatnot. I don't plan out my whole day or week. I normally just have tasks I set myself to complete on specific days, and sometimes specific times on specific days. Also, the categorization of the tasks really helps, right? Like into social and research and so on, because it helps me account for prioritization. The fact that my scheduling is broken up in this way allows me to interweave my prioritization with my scheduling process. As for when I'm immersed in a task, I try to hit a state of, flow. That's basically a psychological state of deep focus, attention, productivity, and so on. Now, I don't follow any specific technique, like the Pomodoro technique or anything, and I usually just use paper and pen or pencil for my task and goal system, like no fancy apps. And I also take breaks, every once in a while to, like, kick the soccer ball around my house or whatever. How do I ensure that I have quality time? Well, I put away distractions, so, like, put the phone away. How much time do I study and research per day? It varies a lot. It all depends on the tasks and the goals. I mean, I genuinely can't say. I mean, sometimes I spend many, many hours a day studying. Sometimes I only spend 30 minutes. It varies a ton. I don't think rigidity is the key. For example, like spend exactly 4 hours on each day, 1 hour in the morning, 1 hour, like that sort of thing. Instead, I think flexibility is the key in conjunction with a system of tasks and goals with specific due as in D-O, and due as in D-U-E dates. So both of those things. And I guess one piece of general advice that I have is just to maximize your consumption of quality information. So, for example, I never do laundry without listening to Audible or some lecture video or YouTube video, which is, like, enlightening. Walking between classes, I'm always accompanied by Audible or some lecture video and so on. So when I'm not, like, writing or doing something that requires my intellectual attention or at least my full exertion, so, like, working out, like my workouts usually, I'm not able to focus on a lecture or so on because it's pretty intense, so I just listen to music. Whenever I'm not doing something that requires that kind of full-blown attention, I'm almost always consuming information. So Logical Liberty has 8 questions. That's cheating, but I'm going to allow it. So one, favorite contemporary philosophers, in no order, Alexander Proust, Josh Rasmussen, Graham Oppy, Alex Malpass. No order. Favorite historical philosophers. Okay, I've got a number of them. So I think I just did these in chronological order. So firstly, I'm just going to say Thales of Miletus. I know some people say Thales, but Thales of Miletus. He understood the importance of simplicity and unification as a theoretical and explanatory virtue. For example, he had water as being a principle or source of everything, purportedly on one understanding of what he says. He's also a true philosopher focused on truth, right? So, there's that story, I don't know if it's made up or not, but there is this story about him where he, like, tripped and fell in a well, because he was, like, looking up at the stars and he was, like, contemplating things. So he was, like, less focused on this realm of shadows, as it were, and he was more focused on truth and contemplating metaphysically necessary things and what's necessary and possible and the nature of things and ultimate reality. Then he's caught up with that he tripped into a well and, someone came along and laughed at him. But ultimately, the person who's laughing at them is one who's really in the dark. They're the ones chained in the shadows, as it were. Plato's another one. So Plato helped me appreciate that, this kind of necessary, unchangeable world, the realm of forms, as it were. That's preferable to the kind of changing and contingent realm of smoke and shadows and whatnot. Focus on the ultimate things that matter, that really matter in my philosophical pursuits and whatnot. So I think Plato has helped me appreciate that, especially with his cave analogy. Augustine, so I said that earlier. I literally have written here, badass rhetorician. A rhetorician, or it's either rhetorician or rhetorician. It's probably rhetorician, but plus also his love for truth. Fourth, I have Aquinas on here, just a staggering intellect, very systematic and holistic and integrative. Another one that I have is Don Scotus, so rebellious and innovative. Very interesting character he is, and I'm sympathetic with his stuff on univocity and his critiques of analogy. Descartes, a lot of people hate Descartes. They think he caused the collapse of everything, but I think that there's value, at least in his work. First of all, his writing is really clear. I really like that. It's, like, enjoyable to read, and it's really clear. And it's unlike a lot of other ancient thinkers. I know Descartes isn't really ancient, but, 400 years ago. He also taught us, question everything, start with the clear, start with what's clear and what you could just see to be true. Josh Rasmussen emphasizes this, start with the clear, right? And let the clear be the guide to the unclear. And you can build a system in spite of the shackles of received and traditional wisdom. I guess this counts as a historical philosopher, although he's alive today. So Saul Kripke, he's an analytic hero, he's brilliant, he's innovative. He did a lot of work in bringing back, certain essentialist views and pushing forward the debate on metaphysical necessity, founding or at least playing a major part in the development of modal logic and other sorts of things. So just amazing. So the third question, most influential contemporary philosophers on you. Okay, so Alexander Proust. So I think for like every one of his metaphysics books, I've read them and I absolutely love them, and I've read a lot of his papers. So he's probably influenced me the most. Josh Rasmussen, I'm really good friends with him. I've gone back and forth hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of emails with him over the years. So stretching back a long while. And then Paul Draper. So Paul Draper has definitely influenced my agnosticism and other sorts of things. Fourth, can you give us an overview of some of the papers you have under review? Yeah, so I can't give you guys the titles because they're under review. One of them is co-authored with a philosopher physics friend of mine. That is on existential inertia and wave function monism. So wave function monism is the view that there is one fundamental object, and it is a sui generis physical object called the universal wave function. Alyssa Ney, Joel North, other philosophers of physics have developed this view. Alyssa Ney actually has a 2021 book with Oxford University Press. I think it's like the metaphysics of the wave function or something like that, where she fleshes this view out and defends it, talks about how it relates to contemporary findings in physics and so on. So we basically explore that debate, and we intersect it with the existential inertia debate, and then we talk about how both of those can provide a new dilemma for arguments for the classical theism from the persistence of things, from explaining the non-first moments of things' existence. So super cool paper there, and we also bring a lot of clarity to the existential inertia debate. I really want that one to be published so we can decrease the muddledness and the confusion within the debate. The second one I have on the Neoplatonic proof. This is actually a minor R&R at a journal, the Neoplatonic. Another one is on a new argument for causal finitism from certain paradoxes that Proust doesn't explore in his book. Another one is on a symmetry breaker for the modal ontological argument. Another one is on the explanatory difference principle. You guys can see my video, Arguments Against Classical Theism, part 1 out of 3 for that. Another one is on providential collapse argument from my video on part 1 out of 3, Arguments Against Classical Theism. So on the providential collapse objection to classical theism. Another one is on reason-based action and how it relates to classical theism and Ryan Mullins' problem of arbitrary creation. Another one is on arguments from change, so both the first way and the Aristotelian proof. The one is on the Thomistic proof. That one is with Graham Oppie, co-authored with him. And then another one is on modal collapse, the modal collapse debate, or the modal collapse arguments. And there are some new ones on the forefront that I'm working with. So with that same philosopher of physics that I was mentioning earlier, we are working on one on the metaphysics of existential inertia, so different metaphysical accounts, pinpointing that in virtue of which existential inertia obtains, if it obtains at all. So different inertialist-friendly explanations of persistence. So persistence isn't a brute or inexplicable fact. And we look at different accounts of that. Really interesting stuff. And other papers. But those are ones that I'm going to be writing. Like, I have another one where it's like an interesting modal ontological argument from moral realism that I want to write up. Those are ones that I want to write up, so I can't say much about those. So the fifth question is extended table of contents for your book. I gave a rough and ready sketch of that in my blog post. My blog post on the aloneness argument. It's one of the most recent blog posts, so you can check that one out. So I'm not going to list that here. 6 hidden talents. Well, soccer. I'm good at soccer, and a lot of you guys probably didn't know that until you watched that video. And I mean, even in that, I was just kicking around with my friend. It was just kicks and giggles. I mean, obviously, we weren't trying to do, a super intense workout or anything. Memory. So hidden talents. Like I said, there's this method called the method of loci or whatever, and you have a memory palace, and you walk through your memory palace. So it's like a familiar place, like your home or something, and you assign to different words, or maybe different symbols, or maybe different numbers, or maybe different cards. You assign some kind of image to them, and then you walk through your house and you place the image or object or whatever you have associated with that, you place it around your house in a certain order, and then you can remember, and you imagine them doing these weird and crazy outlandish actions and so on. I used to memorize decks of cards, so like I had this system of memorization, and it would like assign certain people to certain cards in certain categories, and then I would have a memory palace, like either my school or my house, and I'd look at the card and I'd be able to know, hey, like the ace of spades is going to be like Lionel Messi doing something, or, you know, like it's going to be Cristiano Ronaldo doing this, or, and then I would walk through my memory palace and I'd be able to memorize the deck of cards. And, you know, I could do this really quickly. So I'd be able to study the deck of cards for like 10 to 15 minutes, just looking at it. And then I could just put it away, and I'd be able to, I'd tell my mom to mix up the cards, and then I'd be able to put them in the exact order that they were in. That sort of stuff, it sticks with you for like months. So I could remember the order of the deck of cards, the entire deck of cards, all 52 of them, for like months later on. So it was super cool. Biking and running. So those are, I guess, other hidden talents. I mean, I'm pretty good at them, I guess. At Purdue, actually, at the end of this last school year, I got to, my fastest mile time was like 4 minutes and 50 seconds, I believe. So I also play badminton and pickleball, and I'm not bad at them. Backwards alphabet, I said here, so I can say the alphabet backwards really fast, so like ZYX, WV, TS, RQP, MLK, JH, DFV, CBA. I also really like math. 7, sports. So it just says sports, question mark. So sports. I mean, I bike, I run, I play soccer, I do badminton, I play pickleball. So pickleball with my parents because they're a little old. What YouTube channels do you most watch/enjoy? This is a good question. So, time for some shout-outs to people. Well, okay, so the number one, without a doubt, is Kane B. It's so good. My favorite channel on the platform. Other than mine, of course, but... Okay, and so the rest of these are not going to be in order, okay? They're not going to be in order, in any order. I'm just going to list them. So, I have a list here. Which channels do I most watch/enjoy? So, I like The Free Will Show. I like Parker Spence's podcast. It's an intentional mispronunciation, by the way. I love The Analytic Christian. I like Capturing Christianity. Dale Tuggy has I think it's Con Padawan or something. He has a good channel, Dale Tuggy. He's a philosopher and theologian. I also like Apologetics Squared. I like Friction, this channel that has AMAs with philosophers. So I like that channel. Vsauce, I mean, who doesn't like Vsauce? Michael here. So yeah, you gotta love Vsauce. Brain in a Vat, they have really good discussions with philosophers, so I like them. H Bomber Guy, so I like him. He has his really good a measured response videos. Those are really good. I occasionally watch Philosophy Tube because it's pretty high production value. Thoughtology, that's Alex Malpas's channel. It's amazing. Attic Philosophy, that's by Mark Jago. He's a logician, philosopher, metaphysician. I really like that channel as well. Worldview Design, of course, by Josh Rasmussen. Love that one. Carneades.org. I like Carneades. They have some good videos. Relay Theology, they have some good videos. And then finally, Shaun, Shaun, also has good videos where he's a really good video, for instance, on the pseudoscience behind like race realism and you know, certain races are genetically inferior to others. It's like, gosh. But yeah, Shaun has nice videos. And obviously, you know, shout out to the quality channels that I've been on, and, you know, people I'm personally friends with, and I appreciate the channels of, so, you know, shout out to these other people. So, you know, Crusade Against Ignorance, that's Micah, Inspiring Christianity, Salem, Adherent Apologetics with Zach, Intellectual Conservatism with Swan, Unapologetic Apologists with my dudes there, and so on. So, anyway, Bronson Van asks, do you ever plan on having Alex O'Connor on for a discussion? I know he technically isn't a professional philosopher, but he's got a good following, and you may be able to bounce some ideas and arguments off each other. So that's a good question. I feel like he's too famous. I also think he's probably hard to get in touch with. I've recently told Cameron Cameron Bertuzzi. Okay, anyway. Yeah, I've told Cameron that he should try to set up some kind of discussion between me and Alex, but we'll see how things play out. Nicholas Hessler asks, congratulations on 3K. Thank you. I appreciate it. Would you consider yourself an internalist or an externalist about epistemic justification? If you haven't decided yet, is there a side you lean towards? So, Trin Electron did respond to this comment that I'm an externalist, and I believe I have had some fruitful email exchanges with the person behind Trin Electron. So I do have some sympathies with externalism, and I've expressed some of these sympathies with Trin Electron in our email exchange. But there actually is an underlying reason why I have such sympathies, and that's a reason I haven't discussed with Trin. And the underlying reason is that I actually tentatively lean towards a view we could call like epistemic pluralism. So it's a view with which I know Dr. Liz Jackson is sympathetic, and I myself am sympathetic with it as well. And so basically it says that, well, it allows for a plurality of epistemic good-making features that can each play an important role in knowledge in different cases. So for instance, like reliable faculties, that's one epistemic good among many others. And it can generate knowledge, at least in many cases. Like babies and animals, say. Like an animal You're not going to be able to have an animal have like internal conscious access to its reasons and justifications and so on, yet they plausibly have knowledge. So, I mean, arguably, again, this is controversial, but arguably, we're going to probably want some kind of externalist conditions for them. Babies and animals, that is. But there are also more internalist good-making features. That is, like, at least in many cases, factors of which the subject is or at least can be consciously aware, and I think that these factors can indeed provide justification and undergird knowledge. One of these is phenomenal conservatism. Like, I do think, as a rule of thumb, things are as they appear, and hence something's seeming or appearing to me to be the case, that gives me defeasible justification for thinking that it is the case. Also, virtue epistemology, right? Epistemic virtues can come and play an important role in the acquisition of knowledge when conjoined with true belief. So, like, virtuously formed true belief. So I tend to think that these are all epistemic good-making features, or epistemic great-making features, and that each of them can play important roles in providing justification and in turn undergirding knowledge. Yeah, so I wouldn't take a kind of universal formula there. I think that there are a variety of different paths, as it were, to knowledge. And so for more on epistemic internalism, you could see certain papers by Bill Alston and Rick Peels. So one of them is called Epistemic Desiderata by William P. Alston. Another one by Rick Peels is called like Epistemic Desiderata and I think Epistemic Desiderata and Epistemic Pluralism. I think that's what it's called. And then another paper that you can check out is William P. Alston's Beyond Justification. So William Light asks, question, what's your favorite anime? So thanks for your comment. Unfortunately, I don't follow anime, so I have to apologize there. Rationality Rules asks, who would win in a fight? Thomas Aquinas, but he can't use his legs, or Jordan Peterson, but he can't use his arms? Apologetics Squared adds, let's also throw in Alvin Plantinga, but his eyes and ears don't function unless he holds his breath. Okay, so this is truly the intellectual question of the century. Thomas Aquinas was, shall we say, rotund. So Jordan Peterson will, moreover, probably have an army of lobsters accompanying him, because, like, why not? So, given that Aquinas given his rotundity, and given that he's up against an army of lobsters, plus the kicking power of Jordan Peterson, I think I'd have to say that Peterson would win. But what about Plantinga? Well, I'm not sure, right? It's not much of a liability to have non-functioning eyes and ears unless his breath is held, right? He can take like a huge gulp of air and then fight for like 15 seconds and then run away while he takes breaths and then redo, right? So, I mean, could he overturn the lobster army? Maybe. So I think there's probably maybe a 60% chance Plantinga would win and maybe a 40% chance that Peterson would win. Philosophy. Bronjo asks, at what age did you start thinking critically? Who is your inspiration? Few reasons why everyone must study philosophy. Love your content, bro. You inspire me. Thank you. I love seeing messages like that. So at what age? Well, I've always loved debating, and even in a quite substantive and rigorous and critical way. So I remember I got my first iPod Touch in 4th grade or something, and I downloaded Instagram, and I would debate strangers about abortion and other sorts of things. And it was substantive discussions and so on. So it wasn't just name calling or, slogans I'm not even going to give the popular slogans, but it wasn't sloganeering or name calling. It was actually substantive engagement. Then in 7th and 8th grade, I, would move on to different topics like evolution and so on. I read The Greatest Show on Earth and other sorts of things. The Language of God by Francis Collins, the director of the CDC, or maybe even former director, I'm not sure. This kind of naturally led to, in 8th grade, debating God's existence and up through high school and so on. So, yeah, it was kind of just a natural result of my upbringing and getting an iPod, and my dad probably cultivated that in me somehow. He likes, in some sense, apologetics. He's not, into the apologetic sphere, but he likes listening to Catholic radio, and so that's sort of it. And so that kind of probably got my mind attuned to, more debate-style thinking. Now I don't quite like debates. I more like discussions and so on, but anyway, my inspirations. So my inspirations, definitely my teachers at a young age, so I won't say names, but my 7th and 8th grade science teacher was just absolutely stellar. He really loved science, he really loved studying, and he cultivated in me the desire to be a lifelong learner, and to learn on my own, to not just learn when you're in school, but always be a learner. Always. Getting into high school and so on, people like Josh Rasmussen, Beth Seekard. So why study philosophy? So you could check out my video on what is philosophy. I give reasons there, but here I will give 3. So first, it sharpens your ability to think critically and assess arguments. So it'll strengthen your baloney detectors. And that's pretty important, thinking critically and assessing arguments. Secondly, it'll make you far more precise, clear, and cogent in your speech and writing. And thirdly, it'll help you discover truths that matter. Or at least it'll help you gain greater clarity and understanding of truths that matter. About religion, about God, about the afterlife, about the mind, about physical reality, about meaning and purpose and morality and so on. So, yeah, truths that matter. It really does matter if what Hitler did was wrong. So, World DJ asks, what do you think of Islam? Why do you think Islamic philosophy is so overlooked or ignored in the contemporary Western Hemisphere? So I haven't studied Islam in tremendous depth, but from what I have studied, I think it's a really rich religion in terms of its tradition, theology, intellectual history, practice, and so on. I can't make extremely confident pronouncements in this regard, but I have read and heard some pretty negative things about the Prophet Muhammad. For example, sleeping with minors, conquering and converting people through the sword and blood, and so on. And that's really sketchy, but I'd need to study it further to have a firmer view and to confirm whether the aforementioned claims are true. And as for why it's overlooked, I'm not quite sure. I'm guessing it's more so socio-historical, geographical factors than it is some kind of perceptive insight on the part of academics. Okay, so Bronson Van asks, question, could you describe where you lean on the topic of materialism versus idealism, or just the concept of the immaterial in general? I know you've mentioned it before in a discussion we've had, but if you could elaborate a bit further, that would be nice. So, against idealism, I think that the best argument is probably just a kind of phenomenal conservatism argument, right? It just seems that most people think that, yeah, there seem to be these mind-independent physical objects. There doesn't seem to be anything mental about them. Like, they don't seem to be mental images in my mind or someone else's mind. They just seem to be, like, ordinary, humdrum physical objects. And so that gives us defeasible reason. It's defeasible, right? It gives us defeasible reason to think that they are indeed that way. Because things in general are as they appear. And then the question is there a sufficient defeater? Well, importantly, this puts the dialectical ball on the idealist side of the court, so to speak. So the onus is on them, then, to provide a successful argument for idealism that defeats that seeming. And so all that I would need to do is just poke holes in the arguments that they have, or at least show why they shouldn't convince someone who's not already an idealist. And so that would be my approach. I'd just take a phenomenal conservatism argument, and then I'd go about saying that I haven't found a convincing argument in favor of idealism. Now, obviously, more can be said there, right? I'm not trying to give some kind of debunking of idealism here. I'm just confessing why I myself am not an idealist in my thoughts on it. As for the materialism and idealism debate, so I'm going to get into this more later on, but I fall on neither side of the dichotomy. I'm broadly sympathetic to non-physicalist views of consciousness, but I don't have like a super determinate non-physicalist view. I think physical things exist. I also have some sympathies with neutral monism, but it's not like I subscribe to neutral monism or anything like that. As for the concept of the immaterial, I don't see anything incoherent about it. I just say just examine the arguments, examine the data, and compare the theories, views on which the immaterial exists versus views on which it doesn't exist. So, thank you, Jesus says, congratulations. I say thank you very much. Thank you, Jesus. That really does mean a lot. So I see you comment a lot on the Analytic Christian, Jordan Hampton's channel, who's a good friend of mine. So it's always nice to see you here and on my channel as well. Yeah, I appreciate your presence, so thank you. Reedin Diliu asks, I don't know how to pronounce these sorts of things. So, if you had to be a theist, which religion would you pick? And how well educated are you about religions, or do you focus only on natural theology? Okay, so which religion would I pick? Well, there are lots of options. So there's one option of being just a non-religious, purely philosophical theist. That's one option. What religion I would pick might depend on the model of God at play. So I guess I truly don't know what religion I'd pick. I mean, I'd probably lean towards something like Christianity, since Christ's life and teachings are highly attractive, like they're desirable. And also there's at least some historical case to be made for Christianity over the others. But then again, I have a very, very hard time with Trinitarianism and with the Incarnation. I actually just finished two weeks ago reading the book The Contradictory Christ by J.C. Beale. Now, J.C. is a diehard Christian, right? But he defends a contradictory view of Christ, on which Christ is a truly contradictory being. In other words, some claim is such that it is both true of Christ and false of Christ. For instance, Christ is mutable and Christ is not mutable. Christ is peccable, and Christ is not peccable. Christ is material, and Christ is not material. And the reason is, of course, because he has two complete natures with all that they entail. There are a lot of incompatibilities between being divine and being human, right? Being divine, you're necessarily existent. Being human, you're contingently existent. Being divine, you're impeccable. Being human, you're peccable. And so it's both true of Christ that Christ is peccable, but it's also true of Christ that he's not peccable, because he's impeccable. Now, there are lots of different responses to that, right? And J.C. Beale talks about this quest to consistentize Christ. That is to say, to make Christ consistent. You could take certain qua strategies. So, okay, well, Christ, croissant. Okay, so Christ qua divine is impeccable, but Christ qua human is peccable. But then you can ask, like, well, what is this thing? What is this Christ qua human? I mean, are you just saying that Christ, in virtue of his human nature, it is in virtue of that, his human nature, that he is peccable? But that doesn't remove the contradiction. You're just telling us how Christ gets to have the property of being peccable, right? You're just pinpointing that in virtue of which he has it. But, that's like saying, what about something's being, okay, well, this thing is a circle qua a round thing, but it's a square qua, a sort of boxed thing. But it's like, what? No, I mean, you might be able to pinpoint that in virtue of which the contradictory predicates apply to that one thing, but that doesn't remove the contradiction. Moreover, I mean, you could just say, well, okay, fine, we could change the meaning of impeccable, so we don't mean he's just impeccable simpliciter, we just mean that, maybe he has a concrete nature such that the nature is impeccable, and when we say that he's peccable, we just mean that he has a concrete nature such that he is, or such that that nature is peccable. There are a number of problems with that, but one reason is just like, well, now we're not talking about Christ, right? Christ only gets to have these, he only gets to have these properties by charity, as it were. Like, it's something else that's the core, the fundamental bearer of the predicates that Chalcedon lays out for Christ. We're no longer talking about Christ. We've moved, we've like shifted the subject. We're talking about something else, some kind of concrete nature. Surely we were supposed to be talking about Christ to begin with, right? One thing. Not these different, like, entities of a sort. But anyway, I'm not here to defend J.C. Beale. I'm not here to defend a view on which Christ is contradictory. I'm not here to even take a position on that. I myself don't even have a settled position. But I do have certain worries about the consistency of certain core conciliar claims about Christ and about the Trinity. And J.C. Beale actually has a forthcoming book called, the working title is The Divine Contradiction, where he's going through and he's giving a dialectic or paraconsistent or subclassical account of the Trinity as well. So where there are true contradictions deriving from the Trinitarian identity claims. And so, just a long story short, I think that, so he doesn't take that to be a reductio of Christianity because he accepts a kind of subclassical logic. But I myself don't accept a subclassical logic. I lean towards a view on which there couldn't be true contradictions. And if that's the case, well then we could just perform a modus tollens, right? If Christianity is true, then you have these contradictions, but there cannot be such contradictions, so Christianity is false. Again, I'm not here to defend that. And in fact, there's a massive literature on different models of Trinitarianism, of whether or not they work. In the case of the Incarnation, right? You have this quest to consistentize Christ. You have Tim Paul's strategy. You have different qua strategies. You have change the meaning strategies. So again, I'm not here to defend these arguments from incoherence or whatever. I'm just pointing out that the debates are considerably more complex than you might think, and it's considerably harder than you might think to consistentize the views in question, at least without incurring some major costs in doing so. So there are some worries there. Anyway, I've spent too much time on this, so that's all just to say that while I would probably become Christian, I mean, I still find it really difficult to accept Trinitarianism in the Incarnation. But the question, how educated am I about religion? So it depends. I mean, I have a reasonably deep knowledge of Christianity, both historically and in a contemporary setting. So I went to kindergarten through 12th grade at Catholic schools, and we had theology class every day, so I have a pretty firm grasp of both Catholicism and its differences with, Eastern Orthodox, like the Filioque clause, and about whether the Spirit proceeds from the Father alone, or whether the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. I know about the distinctions that Protestants have, and, the relationship between faith and reason, and Scripture and tradition, and magisterial authority, and so on. So I have a pretty deep understanding of Christianity. As for Islam, I mean, I know some about it, about like Ramadan, the Quran, the Hadith, the 5 prayers they say throughout the day, the importance of Mecca and so on, the Prophet Muhammad. I also know, of course, some about Judaism, but beyond these, I just have a very basic grasp of non-Western religions. So, I have a basic grasp, for instance, of karma, of reincarnation, of nirvana. I have a basic grasp of Buddhism's denial of the self, and so on. But it's nothing comparable to my knowledge of Christianity. So, but nevertheless, I do mainly focus on, natural theology, as it were, but more specifically, my research focuses are on philosophy of religion, metaphysics, philosophy, and philosophy of time. So I mainly talk about the first one on YouTube since it's the most interesting. Not many people will care about my philosophical research on different models of persistence in various space-time structures. So Eric D asks, suppose a philosophical neophyte approached you and asked how she could get really good at doing philosophy. That is, suppose she assumes that there are better and worse ways to engage in philosophical training and wants to know your view on the best way to improve as a philosopher. What advice would you give her? Okay, so I wrote down maybe 7 different things. So first, I would say read, okay? Read. Good philosophy. Both sides of an issue. Don't just take notice of the issues themselves, moreover, when you're reading. Take notice of how the authors think about and explore the issues. So, and what books do I recommend? Well, go to my video, What is Philosophy? And go to the books at the end there. Amazing books for a neophyte in philosophy, and anyone, I say anyone in philosophy, even professionals. You can learn amazing stuff from those books that I have there at the end. But it also gives you a really solid foundation for people who haven't studied philosophy yet. Secondly, discuss, right? Surround yourself with people who are smarter and more well-read than you. So discuss these matters with people. You have to actively do philosophy in order to get better at it. So the third thing that I would say is write clearly, concisely, and precisely. Get rid of fluff. Get rid of things like, throughout the ages, philosophers have debated the issue of time and change. No, get rid of that. Get rid of that crap. Cut the fluff. Be clear, concise, precise. Also signpost. So that means just telling the reader where you're going and where you've been and what you've accomplished so far. That makes it easy on the reader. You're telling me where I'm going, and I have a clear sight of what you're doing. So definitely signpost. Be kind to your reader. That's what you need to keep in mind. Also get feedback from professors, right? So a lot of them will be happy to give you feedback on philosophy papers that you want to write. So take advantage of that. Fourthly, understand the dialectical context. I see this is something that's abused even by professional philosophers, and it really triggers me. But, there will be occasion where person B is the one who's trying to mount a positive argument for some thesis, and then person A comes along and points out some, underlying assumption of it that people who don't already accept the argument aren't going to accept, or they need not accept. And then person B is going to be like, you haven't shown that assumption is false, and therefore, you're like, blah. No, person B, you've just misunderstood the dialectical context. You're the one who's giving a positive argument for the thesis. You're the one who needs to justify the premises and the underlying assumptions thereof. It's not the job of the other person to show that such premises are false. All they need to do is point out that nothing in your argument gives people who disagree with them any reason to abandon their position. So understand the dialectical context. That's something that I would keep in mind. Things like burdens of proof, question begging, and so on. The nature and purpose of arguments. Fifth, I would say consume, right? Consume. Audible, YouTube, and consume quality philosophical material as much as you can, right? Walking between classes, doing laundry, doing the dishes, cleaning, and so on. You can listen to Kane B's lectures. You can listen to my channel, the discussions that I have in my lectures. You can listen to the Analytic Christian, to Capturing Christianity, and so on. Like Philosophy Overdose, or, those channels that I said earlier. I would say the sixth thing that I say is know logic. And in particular, know propositional logic, that is the various inference rules therein, like modus ponens, disjunctive syllogism, and so on. Also, first-order predicate calculus, so that's basically having the universal and existential quantifiers in there, know the various inference rules there, quantifier shifts, and so on. And finally, some basic modal logic, so know things like the distribution axiom, know what a possible world is, know what the accessibility relation is, know the basics of S5, S4, and so on. I would also, so the seventh thing that I say is know the terrain in all areas of philosophy. So the terrain, I'm not saying know all areas of philosophy. I'm saying know the basic terrain and the basic conceptual landscape in all areas of philosophy before you make a deep dive into one specific field or topic. Okay? Know the basic concepts, debates, arguments, distinctions, etc. in other areas. To do this, you can use the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and Philosophy Compass. It's a journal. And of course, listening to the lectures and so on YouTube and Audible. These fields include things like epistemology, philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, philosophy of religion, metaphysics, philosophy of time, and philosophy of language and logic. So you would be surprised. You would be surprised at Like the fact that in order to evaluate certain debates in, for instance, philosophy of religion, you have to have a really good grasp on things in metaphysics and philosophy of language, right? In modal collapse debates, you need to know what a rigid and non-rigid designator is. Because that comes up in certain arguments from the intersubstitutability of identicals in intentional contexts or referentially opaque contexts. You can see my video, Arguments Against Classical Theism Part 1 out of 3 for more on rigid and non-rigid designation and how it relates to modal collapse arguments. But my basic point is just that you need to know some of the basic terrain and landscape elsewhere in philosophy, because some of the arguments that arise in one field are going to be like presupposing really controversial views in another field, and you need to be aware of that when you're evaluating arguments. Okay, so those are 7 things that I gave. The first one was read good books on both sides. Also take note of how the authors themselves think about and explore the issues. The second thing I said was discuss. Third thing I said was write clearly, concisely, and precisely. Signpost. Be nice to your audience, your reader. Fourth thing I said was understand the dialectical context. Fifth thing I said was always consume. Sixth thing I said was know logic. Seventh thing I said was know the terrain in all areas of philosophy, the basic argument. This person also asks, so I'm still on Samuel Marcoli's question, will you do a PhD? If so, what is your school of choice? So yes, I'm going to be doing a PhD in philosophy. My school of choice is probably Rutgers. It's ranked either number 1 or number 2 in the United States for philosophy grad programs. And it also has Brian Leftow and Dean Zimmerman. So that would be my school of choice. But I also have lots of others in my sights too. Thoughts on the essence-energy distinction in Eastern Orthodoxy? For example, is it coherent? So I do think it's coherent, yes, but I can't comment too much on it since I haven't studied it in tremendous depth. I know the basics and whatnot. What are your thoughts on Bayesian arguments for the resurrection of Christ? So you can see my response to Blam-tasticful earlier on. Basically, I think we would probably, in order to overcome that prior improbability, I think we need something like God's existence arguably on the table, and I'm still stuck on that stage, as it were. But again, I need to study this stuff further. So Nolan Whitaker asks, how much of contemporary philosophy is bunk? So every now and then I'll read a paper and just think the whole project or subdiscipline is misguided and not worth pursuing. Rescue me from my cynicism. So I think that might be the case for the occasional paper, but that isn't my experience. So I think the best way to rescue you from your cynicism is to read the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which I'm sure you already do. I think it helps to show how complex and fascinating and rigorous certain topics and debates are, and I'm not sure I've ever been disappointed after reading an entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And it gives me hope that the various topics are indeed worth pursuing. So SDB asks, views on the philosophy of mind. So I take it that this question is asking about my view on the nature of the mind. So roughly I'm sympathetic to some kind of non-physicalism. I'm not exactly sure which kind, though I'm not a big fan of either epiphenomenalism or panpsychism. Combination problem for panpsychism, and I just think epiphenomenalism is obviously false. Also, I'm not closed off to substance dualism in principle, but I'm probably most open to dual aspect neutral monism or some version of property dualism. My views here, again, are really tentative because this is not my area of expertise. Not my area of research, not my, if you guys are curious, though, I do have a whole chapter on the philosophy of mind in my book. So why non-physicalism? Well, I think there are a number of different arguments. I think there's an interesting awareness argument from Josh Rasmussen. Now, I used to think that this is, obviously a bunk argument because, it suffers from an intentional context, right? When we're talking about awareness, this is a referentially opaque context, and so we can't intersubstitute co-referring expressions without potentially changing the truth value of the sentence as a whole, which renders the argument invalid. That made me really worry about it, but I've emailed a lot with Josh on this, and I'm starting to become sympathetic to it, and I really didn't like that, honestly, because I didn't want to become sympathetic to it. But there are some responses to that intentional context response. So I'm not saying it succeeds as an argument. I'm just saying it's really interesting, and it's starting to pull my mind when I really didn't want it to. I still have resistance to it. Like I don't want to be convinced by this particular argument just because it's like, I thought the intentional context worry was devastating, but anyway. Josh Rasmussen also has a really interesting counting argument. So he introduces that on his YouTube channel, but he also has a paper on it, or like 2 or 3 papers on it, and it's really interesting, so check that out. I also think that thoughts and various mental aspects just seem clearly distinct from certain objective third-person neurophysiological properties. It just seems that intentionality, qualitative consciousness, and so on, these are just categorically different from, neurophysiological goings-on in the brain, like ions moving and so on. They just seem categorically different. They seem to have different properties. And I think that confers defeasible prima facie justification to think that they are indeed distinct. And so that would mean that we need some kind of defeater, and we need the onus is on the physicalist to deprive us of this, as it were. And so all we would need to do is poke holes in the arguments for physicalism. Now, of course, there are arguments for physicalism, but we can talk about those later. There's also, of course, the hard problem of consciousness, Mary's room argument, knowledge argument. You can tell me all about the neural firings and the rate, the hertz at which it's happening, all these quantitative properties, how many ions there are, the exact positions and locations of the electrons and protons and neutrons and so on. But there still seems to be this further question about conscious experience. So anyway, and there are also arguments from like determinacy and so on. So, and the problem of the many is really difficult. Canby is a nice video on the problem of the many if you guys are interested. There's also a really, really good Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on the problem of the many. So I highly recommend checking that out. But long story short, it's going to be difficult to find a physicalist-friendly solution to the problem of the many that secures exactly one thinking conscious subject here in my mind, and that also respects other things that we take ourselves to know. Like consciousness is not some kind of extrinsic property, like you could change things wholly out there and somehow make me not conscious. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Non-physicalism isn't like without its worries, you have simplicity worries, right? Physicalism does seem simpler. You also have uber strict correlations between certain mental activities and properties with neurophysiology, which, that's some Bayesian evidence for physicalism, because that couldn't fail to obtain under a view on which the mental is identical with or realized by the physical, whereas under the view that the mental is non-physical, at least in principle, that could have failed to obtain, in which case it's more expected under physicalism than it is under non-physicalism, in which case it provides some weight of evidence favoring physicalism over non-physicalism. You also have worries about, conservation of momentum and energy and so on. Dualists have responses to those, and, the literature there is pretty big. So, anyway, Fura21 asks, what's your view on the reincarnation in Eastern religions like Buddhism and Hinduism? Congrats for your 3K subs. Thank you. So, I haven't studied this stuff in much detail, so unfortunately I can't speak much to it. I mean, I have this deep sense that reincarnation is impossible, but it's hard to pinpoint why I have it. I mean, it's perhaps just like a basic seeming or intuition, but it's hard for me to see just how it could be the case. I just struggle to see how it could preserve maybe a personal identity. Maybe that's it. I mean, I think it's well nigh certain that I couldn't be an ant or an amoeba or like a butterfly or a plant. I mean, either they are capable of like rational reflection or they're not. If they're not, it's hard to see how that's me. I mean, it seems like I am essentially capable of this kind of rational thought. I mean, even as a baby, right? I mean, I'm not currently capable, like, at that moment, but I still have the requisite capacities and whatnot, given my normal biological development. But a plant, like, no. A plant wouldn't be able to have that, but surely that's essential to who I am, that kind of capacity. And so I just couldn't see how I could be a plant, or like a gerbil, or anything like that. That's a crude argument, and there's lots of responses to that in literature, so I can't really take much of a stance here. I also tend to think that selves exist. Well, to the extent that Buddhism requires a denial of selves, I thereby tend to think at least, that Buddhism is false. Selves exist. First of all, that seems true, so phenomenal conservatism argument. And secondly, I think that might be needed to secure reason itself, right? So surely there has to be one thing that's considering a syllogism over time in discursive reasoning. Otherwise, you just have like numerically distinct things entertaining certain premises, and then a numerically distinct thing entertains another premise, and then a numerically distinct thing comes to a conclusion. Like, that doesn't seem to be reasoning. I mean, imagine if I thought all men are mortal, and then you thought, well, everything that's mortal dies eventually at some point. And then like Hillary Clinton thinks, well, everything that dies at some point is temporal. And then imagine that Donald Trump thinks every man is temporal. So here we have a bunch of different numerically distinct things, and, that kind of forms an argument. Like, I thought all men are mortal, you thought all mortal things eventually die, Hillary Clinton thought everything that eventually dies is temporal, and then Donald Trump thought that every man is temporal. I mean, I guess I could have gone gender neutral with this and said, like, human, but, we're just gonna have to deal with it. So there's a sense in which we have an argument here, but there's no reasoning going on. There's no discursive reasoning going on. And it's precisely because there isn't this kind of single unified conscious subject, this single person, which is entertaining the discursive thoughts, seeing the relationships between them, and that one thing inferring the conclusion. So I don't know, it's hard for me to see how you could have discursive reasoning on Buddhism, or to the extent that Buddhism requires a denial of selves. So I'm not a scholar in Buddhism, so I've just heard that, or at least studied it in my very basic studies of Eastern religions. I don't have anything, or at least I don't have much intelligent to say about Hinduism. I've read that it has lots and lots of gods, in the order of dozens, if not more. Some even say it's in the order of millions, though I've heard that that's really contested. But given that it posits at least dozens of different gods, I think that that's highly intrinsically improbable as a worldview, so... Don't you effing uwu me asks 5 questions. 1, which theory of truth do you lean towards and why? So I only find 2 theories remotely plausible, correspondence theory and deflationary theory. And I lean towards correspondence theory since 1, I think the principal objections to it can be answered. See Josh Rasmussen's book, Defending the Correspondence Theory of Truth. And secondly, it just seems deeply, deeply plausible. I mean, just like think about it. Think about how Aristotle says. Aristotle says we can define what's true and false as to say of what is, that it is, and to say of what is not, that it is not, that is to speak truly. Whereas to say what is, that it is not, or to say of what is not, that it is, that is to speak falsely. And this is just capturing the core correspondence theorist intuition, right? A sentence is true whenever the world is the way that the sentence says the world is. The sentence grass is green is true if and only if the world is such as to correspond to that. Grass is, in fact, green. There's some fact out there that to which the statement or proposition corresponds. So anyway, I tend to lean towards the correspondence theory of truth, but I do think deflationary theories are defensible. So there's a lot of stuff you can also say by way of justifying correspondence theory. Make sense of our usual ways of thinking about most, if not all, truths. It also explains why it is that we investigate the world in order to ascertain whether a claim is true or not. We seem to take our knowledge of the meaning of a sentence whose truth is in question, and we compare it to what we find in the world. And then if there's a match, right, we say that the sentence is true, and if there's not a match, we say that it's false, so it makes sense of our practices. And that's precisely what we would expect, moreover, if correspondence theory were correct. There's a lot going for correspondence theory. So the second question that this person asks, why did you decide to specialize in philosophy of religion? 4 reasons. 4 notes. So not only do I well, I guess you didn't really presuppose this, but you didn't presuppose the falsity of this. But firstly, I don't only specialize in that. I also specialize in metaphysics and philosophy of time. Secondly, I'm just really interested in philosophy of religion. So to answer your question directly, like life after death, ultimate reality, whether or not God exists. I think this is all extremely important. So, and moreover, I just have a big interest in it. So the other reason is really just I find this stuff extremely important. Yeah, the afterlife is on the line. Potentially the greatest good possible is on the line, relationship with God, and so on. Finally, philosophy of religion overlaps with literally every other philosophical discipline. So you kind of can study them all at once if you're doing philosophy of religion, which is beautiful. So those are the reasons. What are your views on empiricism and metaphysical knowledge? So I'm not an empiricist, and I take it that metaphysical knowledge is possible. I think we can use theoretical virtues like ideological and ontological simplicity, quantitative and qualitative simplicity, explanatory breadth and depth, unification, fit with other data and other or best known theories, and so on. I think we can use those to, come to metaphysical conclusions about different metaphysical theories. You can also use reflective equilibrium and different arguments and all other sorts of things to come to knowledge in metaphysical and moral domains and whatnot, metaethical domains. To be sure, I think our metaphysics should respect, of course, the findings of our best mature scientific theories. I am a moral realist, but I'm also a scientific realist. So I certainly think that our metaphysics should respect the findings of our best mature scientific theories. I also think that we have distinctly metaphysical knowledge, or at least we can. And you guys can check those videos out. But I'm not I don't say that Jordan Peterson is a Nazi and deplatform him, right? I obviously don't say any of that. What are your most controversial philosophical views? So, I've got a number of them. So, we already talked about one of them on here, so I lean towards a pro-life view at least in cases of non-rape and cases where the mother's life isn't threatened. That's really controversial, the pro-life view. I'm an agnostic. That's quite controversial. Also, I lean towards, so I am a moral realist, and as for whether or not I accept natural or non-natural moral realism, I lean towards non-natural moral realism, and just as a view as such, that's controversial, quite controversial in the metaethics literature. So I lean towards non-natural moral realism. I also have written on here in my notes, Platonism sympathizer. So no, I'm not a Platonist, but I lean towards realism about some abstract objects, and I lean towards thinking that the best realist view is a Platonic realist view. I call myself a Platonism sympathizer, And I mean, I'm in good company there, though. I mean, Josh Rasmussen is certainly a Platonism sympathizer. I know he's been shifting his views a little bit as of late, but in grad school and for a long time after grad school, he was a hardcore Platonist. You know, Alex Malpass, Platonist, all sorts of different Platonist gang. In fact, the Phil paper survey that happened, in a crosswise comparison, not a majority view, but in a crosswise comparison between Platonism, nominalism, and other, Platonism was the most popular among philosophers, contemporary analytic philosophers. So I'm not alone, but yeah, I don't call myself a Platonist, but I do call myself a Platonism sympathizer. And again, by that, I just mean that I lean towards realism, and I lean towards thinking Platonism is the best form of realism. But they aren't extremely strong leanings, because I'm more so focused on philosophy of time aspects of metaphysics, and not as much aspects that are pertaining to universals, mathematical objects, and so on. Another controversial philosophical view of mine is that consequentialist utilitarianism is false. I think that there are really plausible cases and counterexamples to it. So that's another one of my controversial views. St. Bonaventure asks, what is your main problem with ontological arguments? So I would say it depends on the ontological argument in question. So here are the main problems. There are many, many more, but I'm just making this brief. And these are the main problems that I see with the main versions of the ontological argument. So first, let's take Anselm's ontological argument. So firstly, one main problem that I see with it is that the argument makes a distinction between existence in reality, or in re in Latin, versus existence in the understanding or in the intellect, in solo intellectu. But that requires a deeply controversial and likely false view, according to which there are multiple ways of being. And I think that that's probably false. Everyone, you can check out a really good paper by Trenton Merricks called The Only Way to Be, published, I believe, in the most prestigious journal in philosophy, Nous. Nous. It's tied with Mind, really, for the most prestigious journal. But it's a good paper. And Michael Lux has also, he wrote the book that I showed earlier on Metaphysics, A Contemporary Introduction. He's also written in criticism of this kind of pluralism about ways of being. But anyway, I think that Anselm's argument probably is going to require that kind of pluralism. And I think that that kind of pluralism is probably false. So the second thing that I would say with respect to criticizing Anselm's ontological argument is that I don't think it makes sense to talk of the greatness of a non-existent being, except hypothetically, as the greatness it would have if it existed. Right? When we compare the greatness of things, we compare what the things would be like if they existed. So, for instance, when I say that Superman is greater than Spider-Man, I mean something like, if Superman existed, he would be greater than Spider-Man would be if Spider-Man existed. And of course, to exist is to exist in reality. But now take the crucial claim in Anselm's ontological argument that it's greater for something X to exist in mind and in reality than just in mind. Now, this claim is simply false when we understand it in the hypothetical way, for we need to compare the greatness of the X that exists in the mind and reality to the greatness that the X that exists only in mind would have if it existed in reality. And that's the exact same greatness, right? It's the same X. It's the same X, which is such that were it to exist, it would have such value. I take it that the argument really suffers from these two major difficulties. A third problem that I would say is one that Oppi's written on. He makes a distinction between encoded and attributed properties. He talks about this in his Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on ontological arguments. So Oppi writes, following Anselm, we might say that, since you understand the expression smallest really existent Martian, there is, in your understanding, at least one smallest really existent Martian. However, in saying this, it must be understood that we are not actually predicating properties of anything. We aren't supposing that there is something which possesses the properties of being a Martian really existing and being no larger than any other Martian. In other words, we must be able to have the concept of, or entertain the idea of, a smallest really existing Martian without believing that there really are any smallest Martians. Indeed, more strongly, we must be able to entertain the concept of a smallest really existent Martian, and to recognize that the property of really existing is part of this concept, while nonetheless maintaining that there are no smallest existent Martians. It will be useful to introduce vocabulary to mark the point which is being made here. We could, for instance, distinguish between the properties which are encoded in an idea or concept and the properties which are attributed in positive atomic beliefs which have that idea or concept as an ingredient. The idea, really existent Santa Claus, encodes the property of real existence, but it is perfectly possible to entertain this idea without attributing real existence to Santa Claus, that is, without believing that Santa Claus really exists. We can then apply this distinction to Anselm's argument. On the one hand, the idea, being than which no greater can be conceived, encodes the property of real existence. This is what the reductio argument from Anselm establishes, if it establishes anything at all. On the other hand, it is perfectly possible to entertain the idea of a being than which no greater can be conceived, and to recognize that this idea encodes the property of real existence without attributing real existence to a being than which no greater can be conceived. That is, without believing that a being than which no greater can be conceived really exists. Okay, so those are my three main issues. I mean, there are more, but those are my three. So you can see my video, Ontological Arguments with Tyrone Goldschmidt, but those are my three main issues with Anselm's ontological argument. First, the pluralism about ways of being that I reject and I think is implausible, and I cited some papers and authors who have defended that. Secondly, the hypothetical greatness problem. Anselm's claim is simply false, that it's greater for something X to exist in mind and reality than just in the mind, because greatness, when we're comparing non-existent things, is just the greatness that they would have were they to exist, in which case it's the exact same greatness. And then finally, the encoded versus attributed distinction and Oppie's application of that to Anselm's ontological argument. So that's why I reject that one. Descartes' ontological argument. So basically this says, 1, a perfect being has every perfection. 2, existence is a perfection. 3, so a perfect being has existence. That is, a perfect being exists. Now, premise 1 there is ambiguous between two readings, that a perfect being has every perfection. When Descartes says that a perfect being, by definition, has every perfection, he means either there exists an X such that X is perfect and X has every perfection, or if there exists a perfect being X, then X has every perfection. Now, the former makes the argument blatantly question-begging, right? While the latter makes the argument trivial, right? The conclusion would then be, if a perfect being exists, then a perfect being exists. Consider an analogous case, right? Suppose that I say a unicorn has horns. So this is similar to saying a perfect being has every perfection. So what I said here is ambiguous, right? It could mean that there exists an X such that X is a unicorn and has horns. So I'm saying that some unicorn has horns, like there is such a thing as this thing that it has horns. Or I could be saying that, like, hey, if there's a unicorn, then it has horns. Like, it's part of the definition of a unicorn, and so if there's a unicorn, then it has horns. So we could disambiguate those. Once we do that, at least in the case of a perfect being has every perfection, right? The first disambiguation is question-begging, since it just says from the get-go that there is such a thing as this perfect being. And then the second disambiguation makes the argument trivial, because the conclusion just says, if a perfect being exists, then it exists. So what about Plantinga's ontological argument? Well, that basically says, 1, possibly a perfect necessary being exists. 2, therefore, by S5, a perfect necessary being exists. So the main objection to this is that there's a symmetry problem. Other people have problems with S5 modal logic, but, we could just do a symmetry problem here. So we could just equally run an argument. 1, possibly a perfect necessary being doesn't exist. And so it follows from S5 modal logic that a perfect being doesn't exist there. Now, of course, you then get into symmetry breakers. So Proust, Rasmussen, etc. have written on things to potentially break the symmetry. I myself have a paper under review on breaking symmetry, and I hope to work on more stuff there. Well, I don't think that there are any successful, rationally compelling symmetry breakers. I think that there are ones that are indicative, but they are interesting, and they some of them pull on my mind, including one that I'm working on. But anyway, I can't say more than that because it's under review. Gödel's ontological argument. So the basic idea here, and I'm simplifying a bit for ease of exposition, is as follows. So note, this is an important note, a property P entails another property Q, just in case, necessarily, there is nothing that exemplifies P, but fails to exemplify Q. Okay, so here's the argument. 1, perfections don't entail imperfections. 2, the property being a necessarily existing perfect being is a perfection. 3, so the property being a necessarily existing perfect being is possibly exemplified. That follows from 1 and 2. Well, why does it follow from 1 and 2, you might ask? Well, suppose the property, being a necessarily existing perfect being, is not possibly exemplified. That is, suppose that the conclusion there is false. Well, that implies that the property in question entails everything, every property, including any imperfection, right? Which contradicts premise 1, that perfections don't entail imperfections. So if premise 1 is true, you can actually get that in conjunction with premise 2, that premise 3 is true. Now, why does the impossible exemplification of being a necessarily existing perfect being, why does that entail every property? Well, because if P, for some property P, if that's not possibly exemplified, that is, if it is necessarily the case that P is not exemplified, well then obviously it is necessarily the case that there is nothing that exemplifies P, but that also fails to exemplify Q, for any Q, or any arbitrary Q you want, right? I mean, like, if there cannot be anything that exemplifies P, well then obviously there cannot be anything that both exemplifies P, but also is such that it fails to exemplify Q for any Q. Precisely because there cannot be anything that exemplifies P simpliciter as such. And that applies to any property Q whatsoever, including imperfections. And so, if the property being a necessarily existing perfect being were impossible, well then it would entail everything, including imperfections. But by premise 2, the property being a necessarily existing perfect being is a perfection. And remember, by premise 1, perfections don't entail imperfections. So, you can actually infer that the property being a necessarily existing perfect being is possibly exemplified. But here's premise 4. So, it's possible that there is a necessarily existent perfect being, right? To say that the property being a necessarily existing perfect being is possibly exemplified is just to say that there's some possible world in which something exemplifies that. And the only thing that exemplifies that is obviously a necessarily existing perfect being. So it's possible there's some possible world in which there's a necessarily existing perfect being, in which case it follows by S5 that there's a necessarily existing perfect being. So I don't find this argument convincing. I don't. So premise 1 is supposed to be either a definitional truth or else undergirded by the intuition that if something is truly a perfection, well then there shouldn't be some tag-along property that is imperfect or something like that. You know, that would just seem to compromise the initial property's status as a perfection if it is accompanied by some kind of imperfection, if it thereby makes something imperfect in addition to making it perfect somehow. So suppose that we grant premise 1. I'm fine with granting premise 1 that perfections only entail perfections, or at least perfections don't entail imperfections. I'm fine with that. I mean, a lot of people just say that that's definitionally true. But upon grant, they just mean by perfection that it doesn't entail an imperfection. So it's a condition on being a perfection, that it doesn't entail an imperfection. But, I say, upon granting this, we can see that no atheist should be convinced by premise 2 at all. For an atheist already thinks that the existence of a necessarily existing perfect being is impossible, right? Remember the modal ontological argument. If the atheist granted the possibility of a necessarily existing perfect being, then they'd thereby be committed to its actuality. And thus, no one who isn't already convinced that atheism is false should grant premise 2. And thus, no one who doesn't already accept the conclusion should grant premise 2. In short, the argument should not convince any atheist, since by atheists' lights, the property being a necessarily existing perfect being is impossible, and hence entails everything, including imperfections. Given that perfections cannot entail imperfections, it obviously follows that being a necessarily existing perfect being is not a perfection. Contra premise 2. Okay, so that's my rundown of the basics of ontological arguments and why I don't find them convincing, or at least the major central ones. Alexis Basic asks, I read/heard somewhere that you study philosophy and biology. What are your interests in biology? Are you planning to make some videos on evolution, philosophy, biology, and similar topics? So, I minor in biology. If I could go back, I'd try to minor in math rather than biology. Biology is just a lot of memorization, and I really don't enjoy it, but I'm almost done with a minor, and I only have like 1 or 2 more classes to take, so my interest in biology stem from interest in evolutionary biology. I do think evolution is fascinating, and evolutionary biology is fascinating. I don't plan on making many videos in the future on philosophy, biology, and evolution, and so on. Kane B has an excellent series on philosophy, biology, so I recommend everyone check that out. Apologetics Squared, a friend of mine asks, why isn't your head square? Well, I was born this way, so. A second question that they've asked is, since you've officially become agnostic, have you found your credence in theism has remained relatively unchanged, or have you, drifted in one direction or another? Well, I'd say it has remained relatively unchanged, though my credence in different models of God has indeed changed over time since becoming agnostics. Mehrab asks, what's your view on the famous argument, can God create a rock so big that even he can't move it? Or, can God create an uncreated being? Or, can God create an unstoppable being and then try to stop it? Basically, the idea is that an all-powerful God who can do anything, a contradiction, according to the argument. I'm not convinced by these sorts of arguments or paradoxes, since each of these are they're not even possible tasks to begin with, right? I mean, they're impossible. It's like asking whether God can make 1 + 1 = 5. And it's no mark against omnipotence that God cannot do the logically impossible, right? Omnipotence is defined, at least in part, in terms of what it's actually possible to do. Now, I do think omnipotence is exceedingly difficult to define. Now, one might think that God can do anything logically possible, but that wouldn't work, right, since God can't make water be H3O instead of H2O, despite this being logically, though not metaphysically, possible, right? Water is essentially H2O. Now, one might then say that God can do anything metaphysically possible, okay? The problem with that, though, is that sinning is metaphysically possible, as is digesting food, that is assimilating nutrients into one's physical constitution, as is ending one's own life, and so on, as is exemplifying certain moral virtues like courage. But God can't do any of those, right? God can't exemplify courage because that requires an actual or perceived threat that you have to overcome. Obviously, God can't perceive falsely there to be a threat, because then he'd have some kind of false belief. So it would have to be some kind of actual threat, but God can't be threatened by anything, right? No, God can't be threatened. This definition of omnipotence won't work, right? God can do anything metaphysically possible. So then maybe the idea is that, well, okay, God can do anything metaphysically possible that's also consistent with his own nature. Because those things that I just listed there, those weren't consistent with his nature, right? He can't end his own life because he's necessarily existing and eternal. He can't digest food because he's necessarily immaterial, so he doesn't have a physical body. He can't exemplify courage because he is utterly divinely provident and omnipotent, so he couldn't be threatened by anything. What about this response? Well, then we can just consider McEar. So it's kind of like McDonald, but McEar as in ear. So by nature, McEar is a hypothetical being whose sole causal power in every possible world in which it exists is to scratch its ear. Now, McEar counts as omnipotent on the aforementioned definition, since McEar can do anything metaphysically possible that's also consistent with its nature, right? The reason that it can do anything metaphysically possible that's also consistent with its nature is because there's only one thing consistent with its nature, and he can do it. So anyway, there's a huge literature on defining omnipotence. I'm just going through why you guys shouldn't think that it's super easy to define. You guys can check out Kenny Pierce and Alexander Proust. They have a nice paper in Religious Studies on defining omnipotence. It gets technical at points, but now I kind of like a definition of omnipotence, or at least God's omnipotence, as the ability to do anything that doesn't entail limitation or imperfection on the part of the omnipotent being. But anyway, there are challenges to most definitions, and my goal here isn't to evaluate them. I'm just pointing out that omnipotence is hard to define, despite my not being convinced by such paradoxes. At least the paradoxes like the stone and yeah. So Kyle asks 2 questions. First, as an agnostic, not being convinced of a clear winner between theism and atheism, how much does this affect your practical life when making moral decisions? Do you ever feel at a loss at times, since you don't have a solid worldview of which you are confident? So it doesn't really affect my moral decisions at all, mainly because I think, like, the goodness and badness and rightness and wrongness, I think those are intrinsic features of acts, and hence they don't depend on whether or not God exists. And I also have a reasonably fleshed out worldview in areas that don't directly involve God. So for instance, I lean towards moral non-naturalism, something like also when it comes to normative ethics, something like a mixture of deontology and virtue ethics, and so on. And so agnosticism doesn't really affect my moral decisions. I do describe, though, ways that it impacts my practical life more generally in my video, Why Am I Agnostic? And I also think everyone should read Draper's paper, Confessions of a Practicing Agnostic. It's brilliant. Second question is, at what point do you think you will look into specific claims of religion, like the life of Jesus, historical argument for the resurrection, biblical prophecy, evidence presented for Islam, etc.? I would be interested to hear how you would reason through these topics. I'm not unaware, of course, of these things, and I know you didn't suggest as much. I mean, I've looked into them to some measure, and I do have various reservations about prior probabilities and so on, but alas, I haven't done a deep dive into the literature, both apologetic and scholarly, on these more specific religious arguments, and as I explained in another response, I kind of want God's existence as a foundation before doing such a deep dive. So I'm still doing an exceedingly deep dive into God's existence. So person asks, how do you account for existence? Why is everything here as opposed to not? Okay, so I think it's plausible that there's at least one foundational or fundamental necessarily existing concrete object. I'm an agnostic on its intrinsic nature or character. I advise everyone to check out Alexander Proust and Josh Rasmussen's book, Necessary Existence. They defend a view on which there's at least one concrete object, necessarily existing foundational concrete object. And in addition to various theistic views, of course, or about some of which I'm agnostic, there are tons of non-theistic views about the intrinsic nature or character of the foundational or fundamental necessarily existing concrete object. So you could explain existence in terms of any one of these views. So roughly, I'm going to give maybe 10 here. I just have a list here. So first, it could be maybe a collection of Mariological simples. So Matteo Bonucci. He has a PhD thesis published in 2018, and it's called Endurance and Parthood. And it's freely available online. I might have said Bonucci. It's Benocci, Matteo Benocci, Benocci. And he defends a view on which the foundation of reality is a collection of enduring Mariological simples. So that's an option. That's a non-theistic option. Again, I'm going through different non-theistic options here, maybe 10 or so of them. A second way that you could go is you could say it's a collection of physical symbols, like quarks or superstrings or whatever. A third thing you could say it's one or more fundamental or foundational quantum fields. It could be the universal wave function. So again, I advise people to check out Alyssa Ney and Jill North. They have some excellent work on this. Ney, that's Ney. She has actually a book published in 2021 called The World and the Wave Function, a Metaphysics for Quantum Physics, published with Oxford University Press. And there's a huge literature in philosophy of physics on wave function monism. Okay, that's a fourth one. The fifth one is the universe as a whole. That might be the foundational, necessarily existing concrete object. So one could adopt, for instance, along these lines, Jonathan Schaffer's priority monism. He develops that in a paper, Schaffer, 2010. Also freely available online, I believe. It's called something like Monism, the Priority of the Whole, or something like that. You could also take a sixth view, which is the kind of Oppian initial singularity, which he discusses in his 2013 paper, something like Ultimate Naturalistic Origins, and he's discussed it online. And also, I believe he's going to be discussing it and fleshing it out, maybe perhaps even a whole worldview, in his forthcoming debate book with Kenny Pierce on Is There a God? A Debate. So that's published with Routledge. So that's the sixth view. You could have an Oppian initial singularity. The seventh view, you could have the neutral monist substance being the necessary concrete foundation. So that's neither a physicalist nor non-physicalist view. The eighth thing you could have is you could have structure or structural relations being the necessary foundation. Now, this falls in line with ontic structural realism. You guys can check out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on structural realism for an introduction to that. But, this is a respectable view in the philosophy of physics and philosophy of science. So that's a kind of ontic structural realism view that you could have a non-theistic view of the foundation. A ninth thing you could have is a dynamic physical principle as the ultimate ground. So David Gunn, I believe that's how you pronounce it, he has a 2021 article in the Philosophers imprint available for free online for you guys to read. It's entitled On the Ultimate Origination of Things. And so he argues that the ultimate ground, the fundamental, foundational, necessary, self-existent object, or group of objects, say, are these dynamic physical principles. So definitely check that out. A 10th option is just matter or energy, matter/energy. You can variously characterize that. You could also have, say, an impersonal, mindless, absolutely simple, ineffable one. Just this absolutely simple, impersonal, mindless. It doesn't have knowledge, doesn't have intentions, but it's just this absolutely simple being. You could say it's the pure act of being itself. You could say it is pure oneness. You could say it transcends all multiplicity, all complexity, all differentiation, all distinctions whatsoever, including the distinction between the thought and the object of the thought. So it's incapable of thought because that would entail some kind of distinction. It's incapable of being some kind of conscious subject. It's incapable of intention and so on. I'm not saying that, I'm not claiming here that this is exactly Plotinus's view, but my point is just that this is a view that one could hold that is very similar to Plotinus's view, but you could render it in a perfectly non-theistic way. You could have a non-theistic being itself. You could have a non-theistic absolutely simple principle which is just necessarily emanates everything, say, or perhaps indeterministically gives rise to everything, and it's just this utter unity, utter oneness with no distinctions whatsoever, no Trinitarian distinctions. No, that would require a cause under this view. Anything with any distinctions whatsoever inside of it would require a cause on this view, and it's a dependent being. So that's another non-theistic view that you could take. So I just went through 11 different non-theistic views of explaining existence in terms of one or more necessarily existing foundational objects. So definitely check that stuff out, the articles that I mentioned, and so on. You can also check out 3 videos of mine where I've discussed the question of, ultimate origins and explaining existence. So first one, my discussion with elephant philosophy. I think it's called something like The Principle of Sufficient Reason and Contingency Arguments. It's something like that. Second thing that you can check out, I put a lot of effort into this video, the Leibnizian cosmological argument video that is heavily based on Alexander Pruse's entry in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. So check that out. And then thirdly, check out my video on contingency arguments. And I based that off of Josh Rasmussen's Philosophy Compass article. So TKWTG asks, what's your take on the nature of consciousness or philosophy of mind? Eliminativist, reductionist, behaviorist, panpsychist, Mysterian, or something else? So I did answer that earlier. You can also check out my chapter on the philosophy of mind in my book. So I criticize behaviorism and eliminativism quite heavily in my book. But second question that this person asks is, what do you think of alternatives to both naturalism / scientific materialism and theism as it's commonly held today? These could come from Eastern religions or more idiosyncratic visions, God, as held within the Western tradition. So I do think that these alternative models of ultimate reality. I do think that they're definitely worth exploring and potentially have profound insights for worldview development. You can, for instance, see the dialogue between Josh and Felipe, where both of them develop views of, or models of, ultimate reality that are non-standard. Felipe has this kind of proto-conscious, proto-intentional, almost cosmopsychist view. Then Josh develops a more kind of like panentheist, borderline theistic idealist view as well. So where God creates ex deus instead of ex nihilo, so God creates out of the resources of his own being. And indeed, it does sound idealistic at times, and he has some idealistic tendencies. But anyway, we can set that aside. My point is just that, yeah, there's lots of value in studying these more views that aren't in the mainstream naturalism, scientific, and materialism versus this kind of theism. So yeah. Merab asks 15 or 16 questions, which is fine. I mean, I love the enthusiasm. I myself brim with enthusiasm. So, first one, your views on infinite punishment in hell. So, this is not my area of expertise, but if I were a Christian, I'd probably lean towards universalism. A good philosophical and theological case for universalism, as I've heard, is found in the book God's Final Victory, published with Bloomsbury in its excellent series Bloomsbury Studies in Philosophy of Religion. I tend to think that God could use punishment in hell to purify souls, to redeem them, rather than destroy them. And if God can redeem people and mold their character in such a way that they freely orient themselves back to God, which is surely precisely what this trail of tears in our earthly life is, right? Which we know is possible, given the earthly life, well then it would seem cruel of God not to actualize such redemption in the afterlife. And now obviously much more can be said on both sides, but if God's truly omnipotent, it would seem as though surely God could redeem people and mold their character by means of the suffering of hell, such that they freely orient themselves back to God. After all, surely our sufferings in this life are meant to build our souls, and God's using the sufferings of our life for good in our lives. And if he can do that in this life, it seems really weird to say, oh, you can't do that in the afterlife, you can't do that with the people in hell. So given that that would be possible, for him to not merely use the punishment of hell as retributive justice, but also as restorative justice, to purify souls, to restore them, to redeem them, even like a kind of sanctifying punishment almost. If that's even possible, which it seems to be possible given that it's like actual in our earthly life, then it would just be cruel of God not to actualize such redemptive view of the afterlife rather than a retributive view, it seems. Again, there's much more can be said here. This is not my area of expertise, and obviously there's reasonable disagreement here. Also, there's the problem of the suffering of those you love, right? So if you go to heaven, but your spouse, your kids, and so on go to hell, there's a real puzzle there about how you could be perfectly happy in heaven, how you could be in a perfect state of bliss, given that, the people that you love are just basically being tortured. That seems really rough. There's a really good interview on the Analytic Christian channel on YouTube with, I think it's Dr. Eric Yang on this problem. He outlines certain solutions, criticizes some of them, somewhat tentatively endorses others. I find the one that he leans towards most kind of like a view that is, I think, adumbrated in C.S. Lewis's book. And it's basically a view where the people in heaven can, in some sense, visit the loved ones in hell and kind of, wipe away their tears for some time. And they do this intermittently. Now, I don't really find that plausible myself. I mean, yeah, sure, you get to visit them every once in a while, and you get to wipe their tears and so on, and that might ameliorate their suffering a little bit. It might make you a little bit more happy, but like, yeah, the other 29 days of the month, they're like still being tortured. It's like, anyway, I don't claim that Eric Yang is unfamiliar with this, but I think the implausibility of the various solutions to this problem is an indication of the seriousness of it for eternal conscious torment views. Now, again, the debates here are super complex, and this is not my area of expertise, so I'm just laying out some of the reasons why, if I were a Christian, I'd probably lean toward universalism. What is morality, good and evil, etc.? So, I don't have a definition on offer. It's something like applied ethics plus normative ethics plus meta-ethics. That's what I take morality to be. It's a set of... Now, I'm not sure if goodness is even definable or analyzable, but I do know that goodness at least has something to do with the flourishing of sentient beings, and evil has something to do with the languishing of sentient beings. So, now, what is the evidence of objective morality? Well, there's a lot of it, so it just seems that torturing babies for fun is, like, not okay. It's morally impermissible. You also have a kind of Morian argument. I mean, some of the data, at least to my mind, of moral realism just seems more plausible than any highfalutin philosophical argument that you could give against it. There's also a modal ontological argument for moral realism, which I can't really get into much because I want to write a paper on it, but basically it parallels the modal ontological argument for God's existence, and there's the parity problem, right? But you can use all the symmetry breakers in the modal ontological argument debate and adapt them to the modal moral realism ontological argument. So anyway, I'm giving away. There's also David Enoch's argument from deliberative indispensability. You can check that out. There's also the companions in guilt argument from Terence Cuneo. I've heard it's Cuneo. I've also heard people say Cuneo. So I'm just going to go with Cuneo. Now, there's a nice video by the Analytic Christian on different arguments and evidence for objective morality or moral realism. It's called A Positive Case for Objective Morality. It's a very good video, and it's with an actual professional ethicist. And you can also check out the video on the Analytic Christian called Critiquing Arguments for Error Theory on the Analytic Christian channel. It's quite good as well. So I would recommend checking those out. And of course, you can check out my video on moral disagreement. Okay, your views on moral arguments for God's existence. So we can distinguish between moral ontological arguments and moral epistemic arguments. So moral epistemic arguments might be like a more evolutionary debunking kind of argument for a kind of naturalistic, evolutionary, moral realism picture. The argument there would be something like, hey, under naturalism and evolution, right, our faculties are just directed towards, or at least we only have reason to think that our faculties would evolve for survival and reproduction purposes, and why should we think that those track the necessary and immutable eternal objective truths about what's morally good or bad? I mean, after all, if killing and eating our brothers and sisters, if that would have promoted survival and reproduction, evolution would have favored that, and we would have thought that it would be amazing to kill and eat our brothers and so on, and we'd find it morally heinous that people didn't do that. And so it seems as though our moral intuitions, our moral faculties aren't going to be like appropriately truth tracking so as to generate knowledge under naturalism plus evolution. That's an interesting argument, and I would have to dedicate a whole video to discussing that. Now, Felipe Leon briefly touches on some responses to that in his discussion book with Josh Rasmussen, so I advise people to check that out. Anyway, I find those arguments much more plausible than moral ontological arguments, where it's like, oh, only under God can you have objective morality, or only if God exists can you have objective morality. I find that just extremely implausible. I find them uniformly unconvincing by my lights. I think goodness is grounded in the intrinsic natures and characters of actions, virtues, and natures. So, for instance, I think that there's something in the very nature of suffering that makes it bad, and there's something in the very nature of pleasure that makes it good. I don't think it has anything to do with some kind of extrinsic relation to God or something, or God's nature, or some kind of property God has. No, there's something about virtue itself that makes it intrinsically valuable. There's something about suffering itself that makes it bad. There's something about pleasure itself, which is that in virtue of which it is good. So I tend to think goodness is grounded in the intrinsic natures and characters of things, like actions, virtues, and natures. And so I don't think it's grounded in God or anything like that. I just find that just extremely implausible. Who is your favorite scientist? Darwin. I really think Darwin just revolutionized our understanding of the world. How many books have you finished reading so far in your life? I do not know. Which religion is your favorite religion? Well, I don't quite know. I don't quite play favorites, but I have answered other questions in this video / these videos, if I'm going to make this 2 parts, I don't know, which answer questions similar to these. How old are you? I am 20 right now. I'm turning 21 in August. When and how did you start loving philosophy? Well, I grew up going to Catholic schools, and we had theology every day, so that naturally kind of got me interested in thinking about God, and it really began with a love of science, to be honest, my love of philosophy. I thought science was beautiful. It was giving us truths about the nature of reality, and I thought that was just amazing. I loved learning, and I loved science. You know, I started learning about evolution. I was utterly captivated by it, and I was just struck by the horrors in the evolutionary process, by the predation, the parasitism, the carnivory, the languishing, the suffering, so much of that for hundreds of millions of years, for non-human animals that can't grow like virtuously. You know, you don't see a pig thinking like, oh yes, I just suffered such evils over here, and for that reason, I'm now going to change my life in this way, you know? So, like, they don't develop their souls in some manner by means of this, and they don't have free will in any morally significant sense. So, yeah, I found it really, really difficult to square that with a kind of divinely provident, omnibenevolent God who used this as a very means by which he brought things into existence. The very engine of his creation is death and suffering and predation, and blood, and languishing. and just, yeah, pure, like hundreds of millions of years of these kinds of evil. So I found that so implausible. And run that in a Bayesian form, and, you know, I read the work of Draper and others, and Michael Murray, his book on it, Trent Doherty's book, which is right there. My point is just that this, thinking about that, my interest in science led to an interest in evolution. My interest in evolution led to me thinking about this problem of evil, and then that kickstarted the whole process, and there's no looking back from there. Where do you want to see yourself in the next 50 years? Tenured philosophy professor with multiple books published and dozens of articles published in top journals, plus a continued champion of popularizing philosophy and critical thinking and good thinking. Your favorite atheist, theist, and agnostic philosopher? My favorite theist philosophers include, among many others, Alexander, and this is in no order, Alexander Proust, Josh Rasmussen, probably Brian Leftow, Trenton Merricks, Peter Van Inwagen, lots of others I could name. Favorite non-theist philosophers, again, lots of people I could name, but in no order, you know, Paul Draper, Felipe Leon, Alex Malpass, Wes Morriston, J.L. Schellenberg, and so on. So, who is your favorite new atheist? Probably Hitchens, because of his rhetoric. He was quite good at it. What is love? Well, wow. What is love? Well, baby, don't hurt me. That was terrible. Okay, so love is probably something like willing the good of the beloved. That is, like desiring it, trying to take steps to actualize it, and also desiring union with the beloved. What if after your death a god sent you to hell for endless punishment for not following his religion? What will be your response? I think it would probably depend on the religion and on which religion, which god. My response would probably just be to, philosophizing with God if I could, and, asking about, certain things and whatnot. So that would probably be my response. What is your view on the mind-body problem? You can see my other answers. And then make a video on how to learn and study academic philosophy. Aha, I have just a video for you. See my video, What is Philosophy? Definitely check that out. Okay, so the next question is from someone with Japanese characters, I think. Google Translate tells me it's pronounced Doku Kanseiran, or something like that. Doku Kanseiran. I have heard that you are an agnostic. If you died right now and found that the god of classical theism exists and will be punishing you excruciatingly, what would your reaction be? So, I don't know. I think this is a really unlikely scenario for many reasons, but probably the biggest is God's perfection. So I talked about eternal conscious torment earlier, and you can check that out. You can also check out my series of arguments for classical theism, part 1 and 2. My series of videos, I think that's what I said. I might have said series of arguments. But you can also check out my series of videos, Arguments Against Classical Theism, parts 1, 2, and 3. Part 1 has been published so far. I'm working on parts 2 and 3. And I'm not defending all the arguments that I'm looking at. I'm criticizing heavily a lot of the arguments against classical theism. So, Crab King asks, do you think non-human animals have rights such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Do you think that we should go vegetarian, vegan? So, we're getting controversial again. So, I would say it depends on what a right is. If by a right belonging to X, we just mean an obligation imposed on others, such that some actions to X are permissible while others are impermissible, then yes, I think it's clear that animals have rights. Animals are indeed moral patients. It is morally impermissible, for instance, to torture dogs. Per the definition above, that would mean that dogs and other animals capable of suffering, I would argue, have a right not to be tortured, for instance, and lots of other rights as well. So I don't know about a right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. I'd have to hear what those amount to. It's a bit vague, It's like, as for veganism or vegetarianism, so I haven't studied this debate in much depth. So that's unfortunate, because you have to divide up your intellectual time to what you spend time researching and thinking about. I mean, I know the atrocities, of course, of factory farming. I mean, and I think that that's morally impermissible. I think factory farming is just absurd, and that's about as clear a case of a moral atrocity as most other things. But I have not yet been convinced that it is morally impermissible to humanely raise animals, for example, enough room to live a reasonably happy and flourishing life, and kill them under sufficient anesthetic for food. I haven't been convinced that that is morally impermissible. But again, I need to research the issue further to have a settled view. Fortunate Talisman asks, do you think people are giving any attention to divine simplicity? Seems more people are trying to debunk it, and doesn't seem like people are earnestly working out its kinks. So I don't share that seeming. There's good work by people like Proust, W. Matthews Grant, Kate Rogers, and others articulating divine simplicity and defending and motivating it. And I also, myself, I like to defend it against criticisms of it that I think fail. I defended it against a number of criticisms of it in my first part of my series in Arguments Against Classical Theism. I argued that a number of those arguments don't work. Indeed, some of them are really popular that I argue that don't work. And in my parts 2 and 3, I'm going to argue that even more arguments against classical theism don't work. I mean, I'm still going to defend others, but I'm still going to be criticizing lots of different arguments against classical theism and defending it. And of course, I also think it is important to platform such scholars like W. Matthews Grant, Kate Rogers, and so on. I've, for instance, had Rob Coons on my channel multiple times, one at a time to defend divine simplicity's coherence with Trinitarianism. I've had Kate Rogers on my channel to defend classical theism against certain problems and questions that Ryan Mullins leveled, and so on, right? And I would love to have Bruce on, of course, but unfortunately he doesn't do live interviews. It's just one of his sort of policies. But again, I advise everyone to check out my series Arguments for Classical Theism and my series Arguments Against Classical Theism, because there are a lot of resources in there, including citations and references to both sides of the debate. Philadelphia Collins asks, how are you today? Well, thank you. I'm doing well, so I appreciate that. Joe D asks, what do you believe is the most plausible Christian worldview or theology? Well, I would say it depends on what we mean by theology. I mean, I take it that there are particular theological views and ways of doing theology, and of course I have favorites there. I mean, obviously I like the method of analytic theology, because that takes the methods and tools of analytic philosophy and applies them to theology. As for which sect of Christianity I favor, I don't quite play favorites there, other than ruling out ones that reject science, and other than ruling out ones that require philosophical views that I think are implausible or false. So for instance, I think that exclusivism is really implausible, where you have to have a kind of explicit doxastic affirmation of the proposition that Jesus is Lord and Savior or something like that in the earthly life in order to be saved. I mean, for one thing, babies and all these other sorts of things, and for another thing, the people before Christ, including Old Testament prophets, even for another thing, people who've never even heard the gospel, like tribesmen in the Amazon. For yet another thing, people who are extremely intelligent, extremely smart, and who have studied this stuff monstrously. Graham Oppie, Alex Malpass, Paul Draper, J.L. Schellenberg, and so on, but nevertheless who remain unconvinced by some of the core claims involved in such a presupposition. I think the view just gets all these cases obviously wrong. Now, of course, there are responses to that and so on, and yada yada yada. My point here is just I don't play favorites here with respect to the sect of Christianity, except for ruling out the ones that require things that I think are philosophically highly implausible. Now, I do think that you can have implicit belief in God, and I do think you can have implicit faith in God and trust in God and so on. And you can see some of the stuff that I did in my Why Am I Agnostic video, where I talk about agnostic prayer and other sorts of things. What do I believe is the most plausible explanation for consciousness? I take it that you mean what is the explanation of the nature of consciousness? Is it dualism, materialism, and so on? In which case, I've already answered that, so check that out. Biggest philosophical criticisms of each of your favorite philosophers. Now, that's a good question. Oppie. Let's start with Oppie. I'm just going to go through Oppie, Draper, Proust, and Rasmussen just for simplicity, okay? I'm just going to pick those four. I'm not going to go through all the other peeps. So Oppie. So I do think that he's mistaken that one can't explain necessities or necessary truths. I just think it's straightforward that you can. I also think he should use Bayesianism more in comparing worldviews. But I do think his approach to arguments is very close to correct. You could see his paper in Religious Studies entitled, What Derivations Cannot Do. And he's also writing a book on the nature and purpose of arguments. That's his most recent project, I believe. Draper, let's talk about Draper. So I don't think it's as clear as Draper thinks it is that naturalism predicts as much as he thinks it does. He also thinks that there couldn't be a necessary concrete object. I know that from personal correspondence with him, and I disagree with that. Proust is a classical theist. I don't think classical theism is true, but I'm also not convinced. So this is another more specific thing, is that I'm not convinced by his stage 2 inferences from necessary being to God. I criticize some of them, or most of them, in my video on the Leibnizian cosmological argument. And then finally, Rasmussen. We kind of disagree about modal epistemology in some sense, but I'm just a lot more skeptical that in cases where it's far beyond our humdrum experience, that a lot of these defeasible modal principles are going to be applicable. And I do think that there's sufficient reason to be quite skeptical of our modal insights in such very far out possibilities and whatnot. But just, the limits of conceivability arguments and other sorts of things. Now, obviously, Josh is not unaware of this literature, and Josh has really well thought out responses. I'm just noting this kind of somewhat of a divergence that I've seen between us with respect to modal epistemology. You can, for instance, check out his dialogue with Josh Rasmussen. Yes, Josh Rasmussen. You can tell that I'm tired. Josh Rasmussen's dialogue with Josh Rasmussen. Nice. No, his dialogue with Felipe Leon. Felipe gives a nice overview of mitigated modal skepticism. And I have some, I don't describe myself as a mitigated modal skeptic, but I have some sympathies with their criticisms. And I think it should really call us to much greater caution when it comes to modal principles and modal claims that are far beyond our ordinary humdrum everyday experience with actual things. Okay, another thing that I would disagree with him about is just I don't think his argument from arbitrary limits and his stage 2 cosmological argument inferences, I don't think that those succeed. That's not to say that I don't think that they have any evidential weight. I just don't think that they succeed in sufficiently giving us reason to become theists, rather than taking a naturalistic view of the necessary foundation. So Vaclav Miller asks, what's your stance on the mind-body problem? I have responded to that, so you can check that out. And then secondly, favorite historical philosopher. So I have responded to that. Check that out. Testify asks, Chick-fil-A or Popeyes? Chick-fil-A. Although, I do like to... Oh, there's a noise. I do like to eat healthily. So when I go to Chick-fil-A, I get, like, grilled chicken nuggets or something. So, like, I don't like all the grease and the breading and all that. Okay, Fuji Apple asks, hello, Joe. Congratulations on the 3K subs. I'm sure you'll get 10K within a year. So thank you. I appreciate that. Question for the AMA. I understand that you're a moral realist in a broad sense, so I'm curious where you stand on various applied ethics. For instance, what is your particular stance on the abortion debate? Do you consider yourself more pro-life or pro-choice? In what circumstances, if any, are abortions morally permissible from your point of view? At what point must the human fetus be protected? What's your criteria for discernment? So, I'm sorry to be short here, but I did discuss my views on abortion earlier. As for how I discern these sorts of things, I use the method of reflective equilibrium and the tools of analytic philosophy. So in day-to-day decision-making, of course... Okay, well, I guess I should say reflective equilibrium, you guys... I think there was a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on that method, although I could be wrong. I know it's discussed in at least one Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article quite heavily. Definitely check that out. It's pretty much the standard method that's used in contemporary debates in ethics, both applied and normative ethics. But in day-to-day decision-making, of course, I just use whatever we all use, some moral sense or maybe conscience or maybe empathy or whatever it is that we use. I call it what you want. And then this person says, thanks, looking forward to the AMA, hashtag Vivaldi Winter. Thank you, I do appreciate that. And yes, I absolutely love Vivaldi's Winter. Backwards Man 95 asks, from the Aristotelian proof video, the conjunction of X could have been otherwise and X presently exists does not entail X is a present reduction from potentiality to actuality. In the fine-tuning argument, a common objection, an internal critique, is that the physical constants of the universe could have been otherwise on theism, or at least this fact shouldn't raise the prior probability of theism. The second premise also matches, the physical constants of the universe presently exist. So would you say that the physical constants of the universe are not from a reduction of potentiality to actuality, or Fezer's hybrid view, rather they are actually actual? Good question. So I don't have the requisite physics knowledge to know whether or not the constants are like right here, right now, at any moment of their existence, reducing from potency to act. But it's interesting that you are connecting what I say in that video to what I say with respect to the fine-tuning argument. But I think I'd have to see some kind of positive reason, some kind of positive argument to think that the constants, their present actuality, say, consists in or results from some kind of reduction from potency to act, some kind of being made actual, rather than there just being actual without consisting in that kind of reduction of potency to act, or without being made actual. So I'd have to see some kind of positive argument there, but you bring up an interesting point, so thank you. Vascaventi asks, what do you think is the best solution to the gap problem, even if you don't think it works? So probably Josh and his argument from arbitrary limits. Question 2, do you think that Proust and Rasmussen's arguments that abstracta are grounded in concreta? Do you think that they pose a challenge for Wielenberg's moral Platonism? So I say no for 2 reasons. First, I don't actually think that their arguments are convincing. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But second, I don't know all the specifics of Wielenberg's account, but I presume that he could simply hold, or as the case may be, add to his account or modify it slightly, that the abstracta, or at least the abstract property of goodness, say, is grounded in concrete things. Namely, in the nature of sentient creatures and their flourishing and languishing conditions. So presumably he could go that route. Back to the point about Proust and Rasmussen, what they say in that chapter. So I don't find their arguments convincing, and maybe I'll interweave criticisms of their arguments in there for the dependence of necessary abstracta on necessary concreta. Maybe I'll interweave those with maybe a criticism of The Lord of Non-Contradiction, that paper by Anderson and Welty, as well as Feser's Augustinian proof, that kind of argument for theistic conceptualism for the necessary existence of abstracta. So I might do that. What they do argue, I know this, they argue that, oh, well, there are some really surprising similarities between propositions and thoughts, and, that's interesting. So it's like, I know that they get a little bit more in depth than that, but I don't find that all that plausible. And indeed, one could simply hold that our thoughts' intentionality derives from propositions as aboutness. And indeed, that's one of the received views, right? The Platonist holds, for instance, that it is propositions that are about things, and our thoughts have certain propositional contents, and those propositional contents are what are about things, and our thoughts get to count as about things by having such propositional contents. So rather than propositions being molded on thoughts, rather thoughts are sort of molded on propositions, as it were. But anyway, I know they also level a version of the Ben-Asaraf problem, the problem of like, hey, how would we come to have knowledge of these things? And I just don't find that plausible at all. Knowledge doesn't require causal contact with the thing known. It doesn't require that the thing known be concrete. All we need is, say, some kind of theoretical comparison. We just need to compare the theories of, say, necessary abstracta, not grounded in concreta, with other theories. People who are beholden or sympathetic to the accounts of necessary abstracta, not grounded in concreta, are going to say that their view is superior on account of its explanatory power, its explanatory breadth and depth, and its unification, and so on. And so they're going to say, hey, we have inference to the best explanation on our side, and yada, yada, yada. And moreover, there are whole hosts of domains in which we know certain truths, but yet those truths, or the things that the truths are about, don't causally impinge on us in any way. So the reliability of induction, right? It's not as though the reliability of induction, like, bonked you on the head yesterday or something like that. That's not any kind of causal contact with the thing known. Similarly with our knowledge of the future, right? The future doesn't even exist yet so as to cause us to know things about it, but yet we do know things about the future, and so on. So anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. I don't find their arguments all that convincing. So that's just one reason that I don't think that their arguments pose a challenge to Wielenberg's moral Platonism. But I guess the second reason was that I think Wielenberg could, like I said, modify his account so that he can ground the abstract property of goodness in concrete things like suffering and flourishing and languishing conditions set by the natures of creatures, let's say. Let's move on to Olav G. They ask, what is your position on free will? So I'm roughly agnostic on it. I lean toward thinking that there is such a thing as free will. There are a few reasons for that. Firstly, you have a kind of phenomenal conservatism argument. I mean, it seems just about as plausible as, and arguably more plausible than any kind of highfalutin theoretical argument you could give that has a conclusion that denies it. It's arguably going to be more plausible, the claim that we have free will. It's going to be more plausible than those premises in such a highfalutin philosophical argument. It does seem just kind of self-evident. I mean, expect your own mind, inspect it, and you can arguably confirm that it's true. Now, second, it does seem to be the only way to make sense of the obvious fact that sometimes we are morally responsible for our actions. So I take it, for instance, that Hitler, along with others, obviously, is morally blameworthy for the atrocities of the Holocaust. We can only say that he is morally blameworthy in this manner if he acted freely. If he was not free at all in doing so, then it's not as though you can blame him. He wasn't free to do it, and that's compatible with both libertarian views of free will and compatibilist views of free will, that kind of argument. Okay, now, as for the specific view of free will, I don't know. I don't know if it's a compatibilist freedom, where we are appropriately responsive to our own reasons and desires and whatnot, and it's in virtue of that they count as free, or perhaps under our agential control or up to us. I don't know if our free will is an event causal libertarian view. I don't know if it's an agent causal libertarian view. I do have worries for each of these. I mean, maybe Van Inwagen is right to be a Mysterian here. I worry about the luck objection to libertarianism, for instance. Up to a given act, a given libertarianly free act, There's absolutely nothing in two different worlds. There's nothing in one world that's different than another world. And yet, in one world, one action comes about, and yet in the other world, another action comes about. It's like there's nothing you can point to in the different worlds that accounts for the difference, it seems. It's like so it seems to just be a matter of luck which one of these worlds happens to be actual. Yeah, you just happen in this world to have the action be the actual one you performed. If you rolled back the clock, back to the time immediately before you made the decision, a different decision could have just come about, and there would have been no difference in these situations to account for that difference in the outcome. It just seems to be a matter of, how could that be under your control? It just seems to be luck. I mean, it seems to be just random. But anyway, obviously the luck objection, the literature there is just massive, and we don't need to get into that. I also worry about manipulation arguments against compatibilism. Again, the debates here are super complex, but I do worry about both the luck objection and the manipulation argument. I mean, I advise everyone to check out the video on Capturing Christianity, Does God's Foreknowledge Preclude Human Free Will? It's with Dr. Taylor Sear and Dr. Philip Swenson. They're both good philosophers in the field who publish on manipulation arguments and these other sorts of things. So the second question they ask is, what do you think of James Ross / Fazer's argument for the immateriality of the mind? So I do find it interesting. The argument is basically, for those of you who don't know, and I'm so tired right now, I'm just gonna have to pause this and record the rest of this in the morning tomorrow. But basically their argument is, hey, thoughts are determinate. There's a kind of determinacy to them, both in terms of our concepts and in terms of our formal reasoning. Like there's a determinate, definite fact of the matter about whether or not I'm performing addition on some occasion. Even if I go wrong and I get the wrong result, there's still a determinate fact of the matter about what formal rule I was implementing, say. Moreover, my concepts have determinate, definite content to them, right? My concept of a triangle isn't like vague or ambiguous between different contents, like maybe it means this or maybe it means that. No, it's definite, it's determinate. There's a determinate, fixed, specifiable, precise fact of the matter, precisely what I am thinking about, namely triangularity. By contrast, so argues Fazer and Ross, physical entities are uniformly indeterminate with respect to their conceptual content and the formal rules that they purportedly follow. For instance, if you have a material representation of a triangle, I have some drawings right here, but pretend that that's a triangle, like that could either represent triangularity, or it could represent the band Triangle. I'm sure there's a band called Triangle. Or it could represent a particular face painting that I got in 4th grade. Or it could represent the Triangle supermarket down the road. Or, it could represent all sorts of things. And nothing in the physical facts themselves, the physical ink, the marks, the way that it's drawn, nothing in that determines one way or another which of these different conceptual contents are applied to it. And similarly for things like formal rules, like a calculator and so on, right? Whether or not a calculator, there's nothing in the physical facts about the calculator itself that determines whether or not it's performing addition rather than, say, quaddition, or, we could say squaddition, where squaddition is formal rule such that x squus y is the same thing as x plus y, except for a case where x and y are above, let's say, 10 to the power of Google to the power of Google. And when those are above 10 to the power of Google to the power of Google, whatever, then the output of the squus function or whatever is 5, okay? There doesn't seem to be anything in the physical facts of the calculator itself that determines that it's running the plus function rather than the squus function. One of them isn't even in the capabilities of the calculator to perform, firstly. But secondly, even if the calculator were to perform the squus, what looks like a squus function, what makes us think that it's performing squus rather than doing plus, but just making a mistake in its circuitry? Now you could say, oh, well, humans intended it this way or that way, but then you've located the determinacy in human thought, and it's no longer intrinsic to the physical thing itself. So anyway, I'm doing all of this off of memory, but that's the basic thrust. Our thoughts, both their conceptual content and the formal rules that they employ, like my thinking process of, reasoning about modus ponens, or my adding certain things together, those are both determinate. There's a determinate fact of the matter about the conceptual content as well as what formal rule I'm applying, but all physical things are indeterminate with respect to their conceptual content and their whatever formal rules that they're applying. Hence, thoughts, or at least certain aspects of thoughts, are non-physical. So I'm not sure whether or not this argument succeeds. I don't think that they've proven that the physical is necessarily or essentially indeterminate. So I agree that certain things outside of our brains don't have any like intrinsic intentionality and so admit of different assignments of determinate content. For example, like that triangle that I talked about, that's something outside of our minds that because it doesn't have any intrinsic intentionality, it does indeed admit of a variety of legitimate alternative disambiguations of its conceptual content, its extrinsic conceptual content, that is. But I guess my question is, why should the physicalist accept that the same is true with certain neurophysiological states? I mean, after all, the physicalist's view is precisely one according to which certain neurophysiological states of ours, namely those that realize our thoughts, have the relevant kind of intrinsic intentionality. That is, there is a determinate fact of the matter what their conceptual and formal content is. So I don't see why the physicalist should grant that every physical thing is indeterminate. Indeed, I think the physicalist would, or at least could, simply argue that 1, because our thoughts are physical, and 2, because our thoughts have determinate content and determinately follow rules, it follows that 3, at least some physical things are determinate with respect to their content, namely some neurophysiological goings-on in the brain. Long story short, I'm quite unsure about whether or not the argument succeeds. I have some of my doubts, but it's certainly an interesting argument, and it shouldn't be brushed off by physicalists. I think they need to they at least need to be aware of it and to think about it and to have a response. So, but with that being said, I do have my reservations. All right, I am back. I am well rested, and we can move on. So, Lambda asks, can God make one's knowledge of something infallible? That is, can we be absolutely certain of something if God made it so? For example, can we be absolutely certain that we are not being deceived by a powerful demon if God provided that knowledge? Thanks for your time. So I do think we could probably have infallible knowledge in that case in an externalist sense, right? I mean, God could ensure that, all the externalist conditions on knowledge that you want to have are met. He could certainly ensure that. Now, the real question, though, is about an internalist sense, and then whether we can have that kind of justified epistemic certainty in an internalist sense. And I'm genuinely not sure about that, even in that scenario, or if God could even do that. I'm not sure if that's even possible. I mean, okay, there's a sense in which I think it is, because, I mean, like, listen, take the most secure thing possible, like, the most secure bit of knowledge. Something exists, right? You would think that, like, there's just no way. Surely I'm, like, psychologically certain of that, firstly, and surely I'm also epistemically certain of that, justified in my certainty there. There's just no possible way I could be wrong. I mean, like, for me to be wrong about that, I would have to exist. So, I mean, okay, either I'm right or I'm wrong. If I'm right, well then, yeah, I'm right. But if I'm wrong, well then something exists, in which case I'm still right. Right? So I can't be wrong about it, actually. If someone is to deny that, their denial exists. So it's like, surely something exists. But then again, I just think, well, hold on a second. All this reasoning process, right? I'm still assuming that I can reliably use my rational faculties and that they track truth and that, what seems self-evident to them and, the various inference rules that I'm using, the various inference rules that I'm using and so on. Like, I still have to assume that all that is reliable and that all that is truth tracking. And it's like, I don't have really any proof for that, it just seems self-evident. So any of the arguments that you're going to be giving for the thesis that something exists, like the argument that I just gave a second ago, that's going to have to presuppose, in some sense, you're presupposing the reliability of your reason and the truth trackingness of the inference rules that you're using. Can you be justifiably certain in those? Like, I am, like, certain of those, but how do I know that my plausibility structures, my self-evidence structures, how do I know that those aren't being programmed by an evil demon, say? But then again, the demon would have to exist in that case, right? But then again, my concluding that the demon would have to exist in that case is itself based on my reason and those plausibility structures, the very thing that we're calling into question. So anyway, this is an insanely complex question, as you guys can see. And my answer is that I'm genuinely not sure, and I'm a bit skeptical that we can be absolutely certain in an epistemic sense that, we aren't being deceived by a powerful demon if God provided that knowledge, like whether that's even in the power of an infallibly omnipotent being. Now, to be sure, I am certain that something exists, like I'm absolutely certain. There are just those lingering worries about whether or not an omnipotent God could give us this kind of justified epistemic certainty that in some proposition that, we aren't being deceived by demons or what have you. Because any argument for that claim, indeed any intuition, indeed any self-evident proposition you can appeal to, is going to have to require you to think that your self-evidence structures or your plausibility structures are truth-tracking or something like that, right? That they correspond with reality. And yeah, how do you know that those very plausibility structures, those very self-evident structures, are not the result of deception from an evil demon? Anyway, I got a bit too excited on that question, so we're going to have to go on. Anisodemus asks, who is your favorite philosopher born before 1900? So I don't have a single favorite, but I answered this earlier with a number of different philosophers, so you can check that out. Anthony Rowden asks, what is your favorite personality quirk about Ryan Mullins? He said that his favorite about you was that he wakes up early in the morning to find dozens of messages from you. Sorry, Ryan, I'm spilling all your secrets. So, yes, I do, when I think of, an argument or so on, and I want to bounce ideas off people, I do spam them with messages. So it's not very often that I do that, don't worry. But anyway, so my favorite personality quirk about him, it's probably the occasions where he trolls people. So, like, especially with cringe on Facebook. So some people will either make some really, really uninformed comment, or they'll do something along those lines, and he'll just, like, go along with it or something. He'll just, like, troll them, and it he doesn't do this often, by the way. He normally, it's only on certain days when he's done with he's fed up with all the cringe, and, But anyway, those rare days when that does happen, it's hilarious, and I love it. It's amazing. But again, he doesn't normally do that, so he'll normally even deal with really, really uninformed comments and so on, and he'll deal with them with respect and kindness and so on. But Return Home asks, do you have time for gaming? If so, what do you play? So I used to have time. I played FIFA a lot back when I had more time, like in early on in high school. Certainly not later on, but early on in high school, and definitely in middle school and so on. And I was also really good at it. And I also played COD, so Call of Duty, on an Xbox One and Xbox 360. I remember, like, Modern Warfare, I think 1 through 3 I played, and yeah, oh my goodness, one of the Modern Warfares, it might have been Modern Warfare 3, but I loved the snipers on that game, especially the MSR and the L1118A, or L118A, or something like that. Presently, I only have time over the summer to play games like that, and it's only maybe like once or twice a week, so, and I don't really play much, and when I do, I play like Advanced Warfare for like an hour while I listen to philosophy lecture, so, yeah, but it's very rare that I play it, so no, I'm not really a gamer, but I know how to play, and I'm not bad at it, so. The Unnoticeable asks, what are your thoughts on the skeptical threat of disagreement? Some controversial beliefs, like whether or not God exists, have been debated by an enormous amount of really smart people for a very long time. Even if one were an expert in the relevant field of the question, there are many other experts, and so the problem seems to persist. This skepticism does not seem to apply to many other beliefs, such as I am a moral person, because no one usually is going around saying the opposite. Even if there were, there aren't long-lasting debates between many epistemic peers or superiors on such beliefs. If so, then there would be a skeptical threat. So the argument goes. I have discussed the skeptical threat of peer disagreement in my video with Josh Rasmussen called How to Discuss the Nature of Reality, so I highly recommend checking that out. It's also just a lovely discussion in itself by my lights. So by way of quick response to the skeptical threat of disagreement, I'd first say that I'm skeptical that there are many epistemic peers, especially in places like politics and philosophy. I think that there's this kind of widespread incommensurability. So incommensurability just means there's no common measure, no common metric by which you can judge whether or not someone is, epistemically on par or what have you. I think that there's widespread incommensurability by my lights for most philosophical beliefs with respect to epistemic peerhood. The reason is because we each occupy this extremely unique situatedness on the epistemic landscape. We are all situated on a very specific location on the epistemic landscape, and most of us have evidence and justification that is just inaccessible to lots of other people, deriving from the very specific concoction of books that we've read, the papers that we read, the specific order and time at which we read those books, our own plausibility structures, our intuitions, and so on, our prior probabilities, our priors of various hypotheses, our expectabilities of certain things on various hypotheses, the debates that we've watched, the specific order of the debates that we've watched, the testimonial evidence that we each have, the personal experience that we all have. All of this, the conversations that we've all uniquely had, all of this goes in and leaves certain marks on your plausibility structures. It leaves certain marks on where you are in the epistemic landscape, to the point that I think that there's just incommensurability with respect to epistemic peerhood. Even two people who are experts in the field, they just have massively divergent evidence bases, just even deriving from their personal experience, living the world, talking with people, their testimonial evidence, and so on. All of this stuff comes together in unique concoctions for for each individual, to the point that I'm quite skeptical that there are like true, genuine epistemic peers that could threaten these kinds of, skeptical scenarios, or at least, threaten our beliefs about these controversial matters, for at least philosophy and politics and things like that. Now, I do think that there are going to be epistemic peers when it comes to, like, say, perceptual beliefs. So if I'm in the room with you and I say, I have an experience as of seeing the wall as orange, you have an experience as of seeing the wall as blue, both of us, we know that are telling the truth, and so on. We're both, equally well positioned. The lighting is fine, and so on. We both move and stand in each other's positions, and so on. In that case, yeah, I think that we have epistemic peerhood there, and it's like a perfect symmetry there. I think it would be intolerably arbitrary to just, foot stomp and say, no, the wall is orange. It's like, no, that's completely arbitrary. But that's precisely because nearly every single factor in that case is indistinguishable from both of the parties involved. And so it's a kind of true peer disagreement. Those are my thoughts on that. I guess I should say a lot of arguments for conciliationism, so the view that whenever there's peer disagreement, you should either suspend judgment or significantly reduce your credence. A lot of those arguments are defeating, right? So those very arguments, precisely because there's a lot of disagreement among the relevant experts, but between conciliationism and steadfastness, which is the opposite view, that no, you should remain steadfast and hold your beliefs in the face of peer disagreement. A lot of those arguments for conciliationism are self-defeating because a lot of their premises are contested by steadfast people and even some conciliationist people. So by their own lights, you would have to suspend judgment on lots of those different arguments. And so you can't even mount the arguments in question for the view in question. Now, obviously, there might be various thinkers have defended arguments that aren't self-defeating for conciliationism and so on. I myself, I take a more particularist approach. So I say it depends on the peer and it depends on the topic. Well, it's difficult. I mean, you could call me steadfast, but the reason is because I just think that there's widespread incommensurability between people that would otherwise might seem epistemic peers, but they really aren't given their unique situatedness on the epistemic landscape. Complicated view there, but really interesting stuff. Those debates are really fun to think about. Original Wind Productions asks, on the assumption modal realism is true, do you agree with Neil Sinababu that the notion of a logically possible girlfriend who exists in one of those worlds is an actual commitment we'd have to assent to? So, yeah, I think you'd have to definitely commit to a logically possible girlfriend who does indeed exist, concretely, in one of those worlds. But there's a caveat, which is you might be one of those unfortunate souls that is necessarily girlfriendless. So, pity on you for that, but... So ML Pianist says, how are you so philosophically productive? What habits or study methods do you recommend? Congratulations on the 3K subs. I appreciate that. Thank you. Philosophical productivity. I mean, well, part of how I'm productive is my anxiety. So I do have anxiety. I do have medicine for it, and the medicine really, really helps. I am eternally grateful to the developers of the medicine. But yeah, my anxiety it kind of drives my motivation into hyperdrive, and so I just, have extreme amounts of motivation to complete some tasks on some occasions. But I have already answered the question about my methods for productivity and my task goal system and everything. So yeah, definitely check that out earlier on. So Vijuzui asks, were you aware that the absolute Thomism-like divine simplicity isn't dogma in Catholicism, and that the essence-energy distinction with a more modest divine simplicity is considered an acceptable theological opinion, although present mainly in Eastern Catholicism? So yes, I am aware of that. In fact, I point out something similar in my part 1 of Arguments for Classical Theism video. I talk about theological motivations for divine simplicity, and the divine simplicity that I target in that video, or that I'm discussing in that video, I point out that I've heard lots of different scholars say that that particular brand of divine simplicity is not dogma in Catholicism. So you can check that out. Logical Liberty asks, Relay Theology recently claimed that consciousness isn't evidence for theism because our existence as conscious observers induces an observation selection effect. What are your thoughts on this, given that you've defended consciousness as evidence for theism? So I genuinely can't see how that's plausible. I mean, how is it? I don't see how a selection effect is relevant here. I mean, all that's relevant is that the probability of consciousness conditional on theism is greater than the probability of consciousness conditional on the negation of theism. That is, not theism or atheism. And that just seems clearly true to me. I mean, for instance, there's profound value, right, in the existence of conscious creatures. And so we have at least some reason to think that a theistic God, attuned to and motivated by value as he is, we have some reason to think that he would produce such creatures. But there's no comparable There's nothing remotely resembling any such directedness toward the production of conscious creatures on the negation of theism, on atheism, right? Nothing raises the expectability of consciousness on atheism as it does on theism in terms of God's being attuned to value. Indeed, I think that there are significant probability hurdles for that, right? Not only do you need physical reality, right? You need the existence of a physical reality, and I'm not sure how that's even expected under atheism. Merely under atheism, that is. But you also need a life-permitting physical reality, right? A life-permitting physical reality, and I'm not sure how that's expected under atheism. And not only that, but you need conditions in which life actually emerges, and I'm not sure how that's expected merely on atheism. And not only that, but you need a sufficiently long and uninterrupted evolutionary process, so I'm not sure how that's even expected merely under atheism as such. And not only that, but you need an evolutionary process that increases complexity in doing so. And I'm not sure how that's even expected merely on atheism. And finally, not only do you need that, but you also need an increase of complexity to the point of harboring something like sufficiently complex nervous systems to generate conscious experience. And again, I'm not sure how this is even expected merely on atheism. Maybe I'm just missing something about this observation selection effect, but I honestly don't know how consciousness could fail to be evidence for theism, honestly. None of the reasoning that I just went through mistakenly rests on some kind of selection effect or what have you. So I'm also reminded of something that Paul Draper says. If consciousness isn't evidence for theism, I don't know what evidence is. So yeah, anyway, that's Paul Draper for you. He's great. Okay, Mr. Nesbitt asks, how has your family and peers responded to your philosophical pursuits? So my answer is that, well, they've been really supportive. They see me happy and successful in philosophy, and so they're really supportive, which is nice. Now, they do know about my book, as well as a general idea that I publish papers, but they aren't aware of the details of my work, my blog, or even my YouTube, really. That might be surprising, but I'm actually in the closet with respect to not being a theist. It's not really a supportive or healthy environment for disagreement in that matter. I mean, obviously, I love my parents to death and they love me to death, which is wonderful. And, I've got a really, supportive environment in terms of their love and support and so on, but it's not a supportive or healthy environment in terms of disagreement with theism and those sorts of things. So, unfortunately, I have to remain in the closet, for that particular aspect of my life, mostly just with my family. I mean, obviously all my friends and, publicly, I'm fine with it, but you might ask, well, how haven't they heard of your YouTube channel? Well, I mean, I'm the youngest in the family, and so they don't really follow YouTube or anything. I'm like the baby in the family, and so my family's a little bit on the older side, so yeah, they don't really follow YouTube or things like that. So Josh Wong asks, congratulations on the 3K, dude. Thank you. I appreciate that. He says, sure, the channel will grow quickly. Thank you. He also gives a question for the AMA. Do you eat animals or their secretions? Your thoughts on animal rights and veganism? If not already vegan, what's stopping you? So I did discuss veganism and animal rights earlier, so I'm going to direct you to my response there. But I do appreciate your comment and your support, so much love, my dude. Depickolator asks, how does it feel to be involved with and work with so many philosophers you admire? Do you ever get overwhelmed emotionally from thinking about philosophy? And if so, what part and why? Like death or existence or ethics and so on. Thank you for your videos. So thank you. I appreciate that. So how does it feel to be working with such great people? It's just amazing. Oh my gosh. Oppie, Coons, Rasmussen, Morriston, and so on. I mean, it's just surreal. They're all such great people. I don't quite get emotionally overwhelmed when I think about philosophy and other sorts of things like that. I mean, on rare occasions, I do have deep and significant experiences of the beauty of things like reason and philosophy and argumentation and logic and so on. So there is that. And I also do sometimes get extremely frustrated in applied ethics when some philosophers defend what I take to just be ludicrous views, like defending factory farming, for instance, and also the permissibility of infanticide, like genuinely taking an infant and murdering it. I mean, it's insane. I should also say that I do get emotionally charged, for instance, when it comes to philosophers defending late-term abortion, where practically a fully formed baby and you could just either crush its skull or its brain anyway, I just think that I find it enraging, to say the least. But anyway, okay, so Palm asks, on your channel, you hosted a discussion between Oppie and Coons. In it, you and Oppie both seemed to hint towards some kind of phenomenal conservatism-esque response to Coons' accusation of Oppie's PSR leading to extreme skepticism. Do you think this line of defense is successful? So, my answer is maybe. I would have to think about it further, probably. I mean, I would imagine that Coons would say that once one allows that natural things can be uncaused, there's simply no objective probability attached to the uncaused natural things, and to there being such uncaused natural things that spring into being, say, like our perceptual experiences and our immediate environment. And this, in turn, actually does, so I imagine Coons would argue, provide a defeater for the defeasible seeming that one adduces in the phenomenal conservatism point. So I'd have to think about the phenomenal conservatism response later. I do think that's how Coons would respond to it, but yeah, I'll have to think about it further. Now, here's one response to Coons's application of the PSR there that I do find plausible. I just think that the naturalist can simply hold that, one, our perceptual experiences and ordinary surroundings are contingent, and two, everything contingent has a causal explanation. This avoids perceptual skepticism, right? Since neither our perceptual experiences nor our ordinary perceived surroundings could, even in principle, none of them could, inexplicably, without any objective probability attached, come into existence, uncaused, and so on. So long as the naturalist accepts these two claims, well, then they avoid perceptual skepticism while maintaining their naturalism. So that's probably, that's one response that I at least find plausible right now. Okay, so this person asks, secondly, do you have any thoughts on an argument akin to something like this? Premise 1, diverse populations across the globe in history all find it intuitive, commonsensical, or plausible that some kind of God or divine being exists. Premise 2, intuition, common sense, and plausibility confer prima facie justification. Premise 3, no obvious error theories available, and that's the only thing that could defeat this prima facie justification. Conclusion 4, so we are justified in believing in some kind of God or divine being. This is a kind of common consent argument. There's this philosopher named Tiddy Smith. Very interesting first name, if you ask me. But Tiddy Smith has an excellent paper in Australasian Journal of Philosophy. It's available online for free on Andrew M. Bailey's website. But you can just search the common consent argument for the existence of nature spirits. I think that's what the title is called. And it's in the Australasian Journal of Philosophy. Again, Tiddy Smith, Tiddy, Smith. You guys know how to spell Smith. So definitely check that out. So I'm just going to read his abstract because it's a really good paper, and I think he deals with the argument reasonably well. So he says, the traditional common consent argument for the existence of God has largely been abandoned, and rightly so. In this paper, I attempt to salvage the strongest version of the argument. Surprisingly, the strongest version of the argument supports the proposition not that a God exists, but that animism is probably true, and that such things as mountains, rivers, and forest spirits probably exist. I consider some plausible debunking arguments, ultimately finding that it is trickier to debunk the animist's claims than it might first appear. I conclude that there exists one significant argument in favor of animism that has hitherto gone unstated in the philosophy of religion. So I advise everyone to check out that paper, because he does criticize this kind of common consent argument. Premise 2 says that intuition, common sense, and plausibility confer prima facie justification. I think that's probably true. Premise 3, no obvious error theory is available, and that's the only thing that could defeat this prima facie justification. So I don't think that's right. There are indeed plausible error theories, firstly, so that's what I'm going to say. So I think you could have, for instance, evolutionary debunking considerations and like a hyperactive agency detection device or other sorts of things in the cognitive science of religion that can plausibly generate beliefs in, evolutionarily speaking, generate beliefs in kinds of maybe higher powers or immaterial spirits and things like that. That's probably one error theory, and that's not going to be truth tracking. And so we kind of have a debunking explanation that isn't truth tracking of the relevant phenomenon, such that we can block the kind of inference to the prima facie defeasible justification of the deliverances of such faculties. Also, I would say that there's tons of other stuff that defeats this prima facie justification other than an error theory. So I would just reject premise 3 yet another further ground. Across all these such cultures, you might have some really, really, really generalized, vague belief in something that's like higher than us. But like, when you look at the more specifics, there's profound disagreement. Some of them are going to think that it's some kind of physical being, or some kind of higher physical being, or higher physical spirits. Others are going to think that it's some kind of pantheist model. So I think a lot of Native American religions have the Great Spirit or something, and it's sort of like pantheist-esque. Others have views where it's just, this huge pantheon of different things. Others have ones where it's like, it's just the ancestor. It's the immaterial spirits of their ancestors and so on that go on, and they like return to the sun, or, things like that. Like, you look, yeah, there are these kind of more supernatural things like that, but there's huge disagreement over the specific character. So like, although you might have this very, very vague agreement across these different times and cultures and societies and evolutionary epochs, although you might have this vague agreement over there being some kind of higher power of some kind, there's profound disagreement over the intrinsic character and nature of it. I think that should really clue us in to the fact that there doesn't seem to be any underlying, undergirding process that is, there doesn't seem to be some kind of unifying explanation such that the cognitive faculties of these people are genuinely believing these things because they're true, but rather there's some other factor going on, and I think that should clue us into some kind of debunking explanation. Also, the agreement, again, is pretty frail and gerrymandered. So, Tiddy Smith writes, so I'm just going to quote him here, "The claim that near enough all people at all times have believed in God or gods seems misleading at best, simply false at worst. Sure, the world's religions share some amount of overlap that one cannot overlook, but this overlap is often vague and imprecise. In his Natural History of Religion, Hume notes the sketchiness of the agreement between isolated religions. So Hume writes, "The belief of invisible, intelligent power has been very generally diffused over the human race in all places and all ages. But it has neither perhaps been so universal as to admit of no exception, nor has it been in any degree uniform in the ideas which it has suggested." End quote. So, although one might concede that religions typically posit the existence of, as Hume puts it, invisible, intelligent power, or spiritual beings, or intentional agency that one does not normally physically encounter, it seems that a specific commitment to creator gods, or high gods, is not at all universal to the world's religions. Moreover, it's unclear whether a commitment to gods is even the most common commitment found across a diverse range of religious cultures. And in fact, Tiddy Smith goes on to do empirical work in this paper, pointing out that actually animism is something that is far more universal than belief in some kind of high god or high gods. Moreover, here's another defeater of this kind of argument. Any argument for atheism is ipso facto a defeater, or more accurately, a potential defeater. And so I think it's false to say that the only thing that could defeat this prima facie justification is an obvious error theory. Anyway, I think that there are a lot of issues with premise 1, and I think premise 3, and premise 1 is also implausible, given that agreement is highly gerrymandered and super vague, and there's far more disagreement than we would think. Lipton T asks, "Have you looked into any forms of Scotism or any of the current scholarship on him, like the work of Andrew Lazella, Alan B. Wolter, or Richard Cross?" So I have looked into Scotism some, and but I do need to study it further, of course. I've mainly looked into the work of Scotus scholars Tom Ward, Thomas Williams, and I think it's Francesco de Ettore or something. I might have gotten the first name wrong, but I know it's de Ettore, so D-E-T-T-O-R-E. There's a paper in particular that I like on Scotism, and it's called Complexity Without Composition, Duns Scotus on Divine Simplicity, and it's by Jeff Steele and Thomas Williams. So if anyone's interested, I advise you guys to check out that paper. So Jay Holden asks, "What are your thoughts on necessitarianism? What about the relationship between Platonism and necessitarianism? It seems like we wouldn't need to posit a necessary supreme being if everything is necessary." Okay, so my answer is that I do find necessitarianism implausible. Presumably throughout these videos, or this video, I don't know if I'm going to post it in 1 or 2 videos, I've blinked some number of times. So this is a total rough estimate, but I'm going to say I blinked 2,000 times, okay? Let's just say that, or 2,301 times. Now, I think it's obvious that I could have blinked 2,302 times, or 2,300 times, or maybe 2,299 times. That just seems obvious. Or when I'm wiggling my finger here, it's surely I can just wiggle it a millimeter further, on one of those occasions. And that's not compatible with necessitarianism. So I think that there's this kind of Morean argument against it. It's any argument you give for necessitarianism is less plausible than the thesis that, I could have wiggled my finger just 1 millimeter less or something, or 1 time less or something like that. Moreover, you have a kind of ought implies can argument, so a lot of people think that Hitler ought not to have killed millions, but arguably ought implies can. So if you can't do something, I can't fly, if you can't do something, then it's not the case that you ought to do it, precisely because you can't do it. You're not even able to do it, so it's not as though you ought to do it. And so if ought implies can, and Hitler ought to have done otherwise, it follows that he can do otherwise, which is incompatible with necessitarianism. Again, I'm not here to defend that. Compatibilists won't like that argument, but as for Platonism in its contemporary analytic variety, that just says that there are non-spatiotemporal, necessarily existing, independent abstract objects. For example, like mathematical objects, propositions, universals, or properties, and so on. Now, this seems tangential to necessitarianism by my lights, right? This is just talking about the abstract realm. It doesn't say anything about the concrete realm being necessary or contingent. And as for whether or not necessitarianism removes the need to posit a supreme necessary being, it might remove some justification for positing a supreme necessary being, insofar as some of the explanatory demands that lead us to think, or that lead some people to think that there must be such a necessary supreme being, is that the things around us seem as though they genuinely could have been absent from reality. And it's precisely because they genuinely could have been absent from reality that we need some account as to why they are in reality. But if everything is necessary, then you completely remove that justification. But with that being said, I do think other motivations will remain intact for a necessary supreme being. So for instance, you could just run a lot of the contingency arguments in terms of dependence and independence. You could probably get the argument up and running like that, instead of focusing on necessary and contingent. And then defenders of such arguments are going to say like, oh, well, we've arrived at some independent necessary being, and so then they're going to just run their stage 2 inferences on what could plausibly demarcate an independent necessary being from a dependent necessary being. And they're going to go through and say, oh, well, only the divine attributes or, other sorts of things could demarcate that. So I think it does remove some motivation for positing a supreme necessary being, but I do think that other motivations are going to remain intact. Samuel Mercoli asks, thoughts on humor's ethical veganism? So my answer is just that I think it's intellectually respectable, and I haven't read his book on ethical veganism, at least yet, but I have read his chapter or chapters on it in his book Knowledge, Reality, and Value, which is right there. I did give my thoughts on veganism earlier on in this video, so I would advise people to check that out. Now, all in all, my point there is just I do need to research further these issues in applied ethics, including animal ethics. I need to, maintain the requisite epistemic humility in this regard, and to recognize that I can't have really confident pronouncements on this matter because I haven't researched the philosophical literature there in depth. So that's really what I would say in that regard. David Lopez Flores asks, did you cut your hair? Well, I did. Well, okay, well, I guess someone else cut it, but you get what I'm saying. This person also asks, why did you cut your hair? Well, it was too long and unwieldy, so if you were in a 12-round boxing match with Danny DeVito, do you think you could win? So I do think I could. I'm reasonably athletic, so... The third question is, what criteria would theism have to meet in order for your position to change from agnosticism to theism? So I would say either A, a strengthening of the arguments for theism in my mind, B, a weakening of the arguments against theism in my mind, or C, an introduction of sufficiently strong new arguments or evidence into my assessment. So you can see my video on why am I agnostic for more details on that sort of stuff. Okay, GB asks, what are the top 3 books you've ever read, not including your own, and not exclusive to philosophy? Love your work, mate. Well, thank you. I do appreciate that. Top 3. I mean, oh man, I did answer a similar question earlier on with respect to my 3 favorite books, but that is slightly different than this. So I'm not really going to rank these, but I do love Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. I love Alexander Proust's Principle, Sufficient Reason, or Reassessment. Like I said earlier on, that awakened me from my dogmatic slumbers. I also really enjoyed Lord of the Flies. Finally, I really enjoyed, so I read this when I was quite young, but I really did enjoy And Then There Were None by, I think, Agatha Christie. Rishab Warrior asks, are you going to make more videos explaining certain views and stuff? Like, for example, doing a whole video explaining and exploring Aristotelian causation and change or something like that. So I think that's an excellent suggestion, and my answer is perhaps. So, as you know, I'm really super duper busy, but I'm definitely 1000% open to it. Y'all, like, if you want to make a one-time donation, for instance, to request a video, like, I'm totally down with that. We could pick, like, a Stanford Encyclopedia Philosophy article or a Philosophy Compass article or something like that, and I can make, like, a lecture based on it. We'd probably have to discuss, like, the topic or the length and the quote-unquote price over email, but I think that would be a fun thing to do. So if any of you guys are interested in that, we could do that. Hit me up. And then Logos asks, question, what do you think of an unsatisfiable quadruple instead of an unsatisfiable pair? 1, an infinite sequence or an ordered set. 2, the Benedetti rule A, if P causes X, then no later or prior P causes X. 3, Benedetti rule B, if no later or prior P causes X, the P causes X. And 4, an uninterrupted application of any Benedetti rule, A, B, where present. Denying any one of the 4 produces a paradox-free system. D1, denial of 1 produces finitism, denial of 2 produces X is always caused, but no P causes X. Denying 3 produces a view on which X is never caused for any P, and then denying 4 gives you finitely many causes at a time produce effects even over an infinite duration. Trying to assume 1 and 4 means that 2 results in an infinite set in which X is never caused. 3 results in a set where X is always caused, and so of course you'd get a contradiction when you put them together. Putting 2 and 3 together means you have a rule that necessitates a first member, which means you have to reject 1, or you have to reject 4 to avoid contradiction. I think this is a more clear presentation of the contradiction, does what unsatisfiable pair wants to do, but avoids talk of a mysterious force due to how it's clear what propositions are trying to be merged together. Thanks. Well, thank you for your comment. I do appreciate that. So my answer is just that I'm certainly open to this being a clearer presentation of the contradiction, but I do worry that those 1 through 4 that you listed, I worry that those are already encapsulated in the UPD, or in the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis conditions A and B. So recall such conditions, right? Condition A is we have an infinite or non-well-founded set with a total ordering relation on it. That is, we have an infinite sequence or series. And then B, the B condition, we have the following holding true of the set. For each member M of that above set that I just mentioned, some property or condition P holds at that member M, if and only if P holds nowhere else along the ordering relation in the direction of non-well-foundedness. So that's the A and the B conditions. Now, 1 in what Logos says here is just A, right? 1 is just A. 1, but I'm just referring to what Logos said when he gave his 1. Both 2 and 3 in what Logos says are just both directions of the biconditional in B. And 4 in what Logos says, that's captured by the universal quantifier in B, right? You have for each member M of the above set. If you have the universal quantifier, that entails that the thing in question, the series in question, is going to be uninterrupted in its application of the rule. Because if there were some interruption, well, then there would be some member of the set of which it is false that P holds at that member, if and only if it holds nowhere before it. And hence, the universal quantifier already captures 4. So I don't really exactly see what the unsatisfiable quadruple adds. All of it is already captured, it seems to me, in the A and B conditions of the UPD. I don't quite see what it adds. I mean, maybe, just maybe it could add some greater clarity insofar as it breaks apart the biconditional as well as the universal quantifier in B, in condition B of the UPD. But other than that, I do think that the UPD is sufficient to get across the message. I mean, I do love clarity, so I don't really have an objection in principle to your unsatisfiable quadruple. I just think that it's already captured in the much simpler, more elegant UPD's conditions A and B. So definitely lots more can be said, but I'm going to have to move on. So Dima Zhivov says, you are the best. Thank you, Dima. I do appreciate that. Hayan Sheik says, or asks, when is Dr. Proust coming on? With crying emojis. So I wish I could have Dr. Proust on, but he kind of has this policy where he doesn't really do online discussions and things like that, online interviews. He'll do it in written format, but he kind of has a policy where he just doesn't do that. So unfortunately, he's probably not going to be coming on. No, Not High asks, a list of 5 philosophy books you think would lead a noob towards some decent philosophical literacy. I have just the video for you. My video, What is Philosophy? I give like 13 book suggestions near the end of that, and they are just amazing for getting a noob to philosophy to have a really good, solid foundation in philosophy. Those books are just, I love them. Return Home asks, what metaphysics do you adhere to, and what metaphysics do you like or prefer in order? Well, I would say it depends on the view in question, right? So metaphysics is like this huge area with all sorts of different debates, ranging from causation to time to change to modality to persistence, to composition, to like all these other sorts of things. It's a diverse area. In terms of some of my sympathies in some of these areas, I do have some kind of leaning or sympathy towards a more contemporary analytic neo-Aristotelian metaphysics. So for instance, I think that there are substances, so I'm not like a bundle theorist. I take a super broadly Aristotelian approach. I think that there are essential and non-essential properties, following Kripke and others. I just hit something. I do think that there are essential properties and non-essential properties of things. I tend to think that there are causal powers, that things have various powers that they exercise. And I do also think that possibility, for instance, is grounded in actuality and the causal powers of actual things. That puts me in line with a more Aristotelian approach to the metaphysics of modality, which is defended in Proust's book right there. It's also held by lots of other really respectable thinkers. It's a more branching view of modality, so Oppie holds it, at least to a broad version of it. Coons holds to it, Proust holds to it, Josh Rasmussen has sympathies with it, Alex Malpass holds to it, and on down the list. So anyway, I think it's really plausible. Again, I want to say that this certainly doesn't apply across the board. Like so I don't describe myself as a full-blown neo-Aristotelian metaphysician, but you can tell that I have some sympathies with the kind of contemporary analytic neo-Aristotelianism when it comes to things like essential and non-essential properties, substances being in my ontology, causal powers being in my ontology, powers being the ground of possibility in my ontology, and so on. So I would say it depends on the issue. So just because metaphysics it's sort of a unified field, but there are so many disparate aspects of it that I don't think that there's some underlying overarching metaphysics that dictates things. So Trin Electro asks, congrats on the subs. So thank you, I do appreciate that. This person says, so many questions to ask, but you can pick however many you wish. So this is what I'm going to say now. In response to that, I'm just going to go rapid fire with these, because they're quite abstract and heavy and deep, and there are many of them, so I'll just have to do rapid fire. Do you think the problem of the criterion can be solved? So, maybe not in a way that should rationally compel all to assent, but there's a sense in which I think it's solved, in the sense that I think that particularism is the best and correct solution to it, so yes, I'm a particularist. The second question: what is your biggest problem with Spinoza's metaphysics? So I think that necessitarianism is probably false, and I also think that there's more than one substance in reality. Do you think motion and space are absolute? So motion is almost certainly not absolute, and I don't know whether space is absolute, though I do lean towards a relational view of space. 4. What are your views on the nature of time and change? So I think change exists. As for time, I very tentatively lean towards presentism in order to account for our temporal experience, as well as the natural fit between endurantism and presentism. I think that there are good reasons in favor of endurantism deriving from moral responsibility and diachronic identity and things like that. So anyway, I do recognize that there are certain problems for presentism deriving from truth-making and from the relativity of simultaneity and so on. So whether they are insuperable or decisive or evidentially significant, that's a topic for another day. What is your biggest problem with Parmenides? So I think that change is real, and I think that there are distinctions between things. I tend to think that it depends on the scholar that you ask, but his kind of radical monism, where there doesn't seem to be a distinction between anything, like, well, then is there no distinction between, like, a valid and an invalid argument, or a sound and an unsound argument? But then he's trying to give us arguments that he takes to be valid in contradistinction to arguments against his view, which he takes either to be invalid or unsound. So it's like, anyway, I tend to think that it might potentially be self-defeating, but we can set that aside. Also, a criticism of Parmenides: I don't think change requires some kind of inexplicable emergence of being from non-being. Rather, I think things come from, that is, are caused by or brought about by, other things, right? This need not require some kind of intolerable emergence of being from utter non-being. So the sixth thing: why can't a cyclical causal chain be ontologically independent? The main reason I answer that is because I think circles of causation are incoherent. I don't claim that, like, that's a rationally compelling view. I don't think that everyone has to hold that. But I think it's incoherent because I think causation is transitive, so that if X causes Y and Y causes Z, there's at least some sense in which X causes Z. And so a circular causal chain would ultimately entail self-causation. And I think self-causation is absurd, since it requires something to be prior to itself, whether ontologically prior or temporally prior. So in which case it'd be both prior to and not prior to itself, which is absurd. Okay, 7, do you think events are mind independent? Well, I'm not sure if that there are such things as events. I mean, I certainly think that there are objects, and I think that objects gain and lose various properties. But is there something extra, like some event corresponding to the gain or loss of such properties? I'm not sure. I mean, Peter van Inwagen says no. He doesn't think that there are such things as events. Other philosophers say yes. I say I'm not sure, and more research is needed. 8th question: do you think the totality of everything can change? If so, in what sense? So if by the totality of everything we just mean to non-rigidly pick out the set of everything that exists, well, then I do think that that constantly changes all the time. How is that? How could that be? Well, I think that things come into and go out of existence. And how could that be? Well, I think that other things cause them to do so. So, 9th question: do you think the beginning of change implies being from non-being? How does change emerge without prior change? So, I guess perhaps something unchanging can spontaneously and indeterministically produce change in other things, thereby initiating change. I'm not sure whether or not that's possible, but I'm also not sure whether or not that's impossible. So, 10, what are your thoughts on metaphysical coherentism, fundamentalism, and ontological independence? So I'm a foundationalist when it comes to, I don't mean in the epistemic sense, but I'm a sort of foundationalist, ontological foundationalist when it comes to the hierarchical kind of ontological dependence in reality. So again, people, we're not talking here about dependence sequences stretching back in time. So this just means that I think that the chain of fundamentality or dependence in reality bottoms out in something or other. I don't think that there are circles of dependence for reasons of transitivity and self-dependence. I think that's probably not coherent, and nor do I think that there is an infinitely descending hierarchical dependence chain. But again, people, I'm not here talking about sequences through time. Obviously, I could talk about those further, but, I'm doing rapid fire. So, can you defend the idea of cyclical causation without subscribing to ontological dependence? Well, my answer is that I think it depends on one's account of causation and ontological dependence. 12, do you think there are problems with personal identity or problems for personal identity? That debate is probably beyond my pay grade, so I'm just going to move on. Are you agnostic about your agnosticism? So no, I am not. I am certain that I'm an agnostic. What are your problems with Pyrrhonianism? So my main problem is just that I know lots of stuff. For instance, I know that I have hands. For those who are interested in just delving into this a little bit deeper, you can see my video with Dr. Andrew Moon on how do you know? That was on skepticism. What is your view on dialetheism? So I think it's interesting, but I do find it deeply implausible. I'm not going to say much more than that. I just think it almost seems self-evident to me that there cannot be something that is a true contradiction, something of which some claim is both true and not true. It's like, what? I do want to get Gillian Russell and Graham Priest on my channel at some point. Graham Priest is a dialetheist, Gillian Russell is a logical nihilist. That doesn't mean that she thinks existence is meaningless. No, logical nihilism just means she doesn't think that there are any laws of logic. She thinks that there are counterexamples to every potential supposed logically valid rule of inference. So very interesting stuff. I kind of want them to get on my channel to discuss logic at some point, but we'll see. Solveld asks, can the necessary be mutable? So I say yes and no. I think a necessary being can easily be mutable. You can see my blog post from necessary being to unchangeable being. A necessary thing just means that it must be in reality. But that doesn't mean that all of its properties must be in reality. It just means that the being must be in reality. And some of its properties could change while the being remains in existence. That's just the nature of accidental change, where it gains or loses some property but persists despite that. So, yeah, a necessary being can be mutable easily. But if by necessity we just simply mean that to which the necessity attaches, so in the case of the necessary being, its existence is that to which it attaches, then it's much less plausible that it's mutable. Like, in the case that we're considering, the necessary being would somehow go out of existence, but then it's hard to see how it was necessary in the first place. But then again, maybe if by necessity we just mean exists at some time or other in every possible world, yeah, it could fail to exist at some times, so long as it exists at some time or other in each world. John E. Hoffman asks, hi Joe, do you plan on writing a bunch of books on a vast many topics in philosophy throughout your life? Oh, by the way, I'm ordering your first book today and I'm excited. And of course, congrats on the 3K. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate that. I hope my book serves you. I hope it helps you, just sharpen your thinking, to think critically about fundamental nature of reality. So, I do appreciate that. I do plan on writing many books in my life. So, yeah. Another one that this person asks, how old are you? So I am 20. I turned 21 in August. And are you dating someone right now? I'm not dating someone right now, but I did date someone in the past. It was fun while it lasted, but ultimately it didn't work out for both of us. So I've got lots of time ahead of me, though. So Eric Lescano asks, do you speak any other languages? I've taken Spanish from like 1st grade through 12th grade. By the time of 12th grade, I was in this really, really high-level Spanish class where you had to do speeches and you had to converse with people and other sorts of things. So like I probably was like quasi-conversational in 12th grade. So this is senior year of high school. I was probably quasi-conversational in Spanish. I could read it reasonably well. I could reasonably comprehend what I was reading. And I could also engage to a reasonable extent in a kind of conversational Spanish. But I don't consider myself bilingual. I still consider myself monolingual, just English. One of the reasons is because I've lost some of that since the 12th grade, right? I haven't really practiced much since. I can still read somewhat Spanish well, so a lot of people message me in Spanish, and I can like read their messages, and I can understand them, and I respond sometimes in Spanish, sometimes in English, and they kind of are in a similar situation to me, that they can read English reasonably well, and they respond in Spanish. There's a sense in which I can speak another language, but there's also a sense in which I can't. So I'm not really quasi-conversational at this point. I've kind of lost some of that, but I'm like decently okay at Spanish, but I still consider myself monolingual. Anyway, that's too much. I'm saying too much. Santiago Garcia asks, what do you think about Jesus of Nazareth? PD, you are awesome. Saludos desde Argentina. Okay, thank you very much. I do appreciate that. Gracias, mi amigo. I do appreciate that. What do you think of Jesus of Nazareth? So I have answered this question, so I do advise you to look at other parts of my video. Isao Ponce, or Ponce, or whatever, asks, or says, congratulations, Joe. Thanks for all you have shared with us followers of this amazing channel. So thank you. I really do appreciate that. I mean, I truly do. Warms my heart. Infinity Prevails asks, hi Joe, I follow your videos. Amazing philosophical discussions. I want to ask you one question and expecting answers from you. What is your take on veganism or moral views on non-human animals? Thank you. I have answered that. So firstly, thank you again for your kind words. And I have answered that question about veganism earlier on, so I advise looking at that. Ariel Gonzalez asks, what do you think about Swinburne's argument for the Trinity, or generally speaking, the argument by several Christian philosophers like St. Augustine of God being multiple persons? That is the argument from love, for instance. So, as for those kinds of arguments, I don't quite find them plausible. First, I'm skeptical that perfect love requires a kind of actual, occurrent love of other persons. I think it only requires a dispositional property, that if there are other persons, then you perfectly love them. But I don't think it requires some kind of actual, occurrent love of another person. And secondly, I think that something can be both perfectly loving and just be the sole object of its own love. If God exists in a world in which God is alone, and God is a Unitarian God, say, the Jewish view of God, and the Muslim view of God, and someone like Dale Tucker's view of God, God could easily be perfectly loving in this world. Why? Because he's loving something which is by nature perfectly good, right? God is the perfect object of God's love. So it's love of himself, and it's not as though it's some kind of selfish love or anything like that. No, rather, he's loving what one ought to love. His desires, his willings, they are perfectly ordered to the greatest possible good, namely himself. And that's not selfish, that's just a properly ordered desire and willing system in this alone world, a world in which we're considering that God, the Unitarian being, solely exists. So again, I don't see anything wrong with there being something that is perfectly loving, but is the sole object of its love, and I only think that perfect love requires a dispositional property, to love other persons if there are such other persons, not the actual occurrent love of other persons. I don't think that that's required. Second, I'm skeptical that the argument delivers that it is a divine person that God loves, right? I mean, perhaps God necessarily creates finite persons to love. So, like, the argument could equally well support a view on which God necessarily creates finite persons with whom he shares his love. Now, you could add that, oh, well, God is free to refrain from creating, but yeah, I mean, you could just equally add another premise to the effect that precisely because God must create these finite persons, God is not free to refrain from creating. So, like, you can go either way. It doesn't seem to me to be able to establish Trinitarianism in that regard. So that's the second thing I'm going to want to say. The third thing I'm going to want to say is that the same arguments seem to support that God as a being, right? Let's not focus on any individual person in the Trinity or anything like that, but just focus on God as a whole, as it were, as a supposit, as an individual, as a being. A Trinitarian being, no less, but still a being. I think the same arguments would support the conclusion that God as a being, in order to be a perfectly loving being, must be accompanied by some other being, some other personal being. Otherwise, you can just run the same selfishness arguments and the arguments from perfect love and other sorts of things as applied to God as a being and so on. And so I think you can get that God necessarily creates at least one finite person, which contradicts the very thing that you needed earlier in order to avoid the problem of the argument not supporting Trinitarianism, but instead supporting God's necessarily creating finite persons. I'm not saying I'm defending that particular argument. It's just that I think that the same motivations applying to the Trinitarian argument as applied to divine persons are arguably going to be applied to God as a being. And it's going to get you that he necessarily creates some other personal being. And in doing so, it just undermines the original argument, because the original argument needs some kind of premise to the effect that God could have refrained from creating. Otherwise, it's just going to be, God's going to be necessarily, or you won't be able to decide between God's necessarily creating a finite person with whom he shares his love versus God's having multiple persons within him who are divine persons with whom he shares his love. Anyway, that's my third problem. The fourth problem is that I think it only gets you to two divine persons, right? If there must be some other with whom the love is shared. I don't think there's anything selfish about such bidirectional love. I mean, think about an elderly marital couple, right? I don't think that there's anything untoward or imperfect about that kind of love. I don't see why perfect love would require some other object of love in addition to the two. I just think that the arguments there and the intuition supporting that aren't all that plausible. And then my fifth problem is just, I think there's a multiplication problem. So I think it's implausible that there's some kind of non-arbitrary stopping point. Run the argument in terms, just keep on going, keep on generating divine persons. All the more divine persons, the merrier, the more perfect the love. So it's like, I don't know how you avoid trinities upon trinities upon trinities upon trinities of persons within the Godhead. Now, obviously, people try to pinpoint some non-arbitrary stopping point, but I'm just not convinced by those. Okay, Ghostlight asks, what is your view on idealism? Metaphysical, not political idealism. So I think it's a respectable view, but I do think there's a kind of phenomenal conservatism argument against it. So I actually alluded to this earlier on, so you can see my answer there. Basically, I think we have feasible justification to think it's false, given that there certainly seem to be mind-independent physical objects. The onus is on the idealist to strip us of this defeasible justification, and so all we need to do in order to maintain that justification is to simply poke holes in their argument. Vituzui asks, given that you could be Christian or even Catholic without believing in hardcore DDS of classical theism, what are the other reasons you aren't Catholic or Christian? So there are tons of reasons. So first, there are theological and philosophical issues pertaining to eternal conscious torment, the Incarnation, the Trinity, Old Testament genocide, and other sorts of things. Now, obviously, there are certain responses to each of these, right? I've gone through some of these throughout my AMA. But, obviously in the Incarnation, you can take a qua approach, you might take a meaning-shifting approach, you could take Tim Paul's, a concrete nature such that approach, all sorts of different approaches, but, there are going to be certain theoretical costs associated with each of these. In solving the logical problem of the Trinity, you might take a relative identity approach, you might take all sorts of different approaches. But each of these, again, is going to have certain theoretical costs, and a lot of them, it turns out, turn out to be heretical. There are also issues that I have with divine providence. So there's an interesting argument that someone could make. If God is to be divinely provident, right, either it's going to be simple foreknowledge or open theism or theological determinism or Molinism. But you just go through each of those and look at the mountains of literature that have been that have been published criticizing each of them really significantly, and I think that can justify you in negating each of those disjuncts to the point where you just perform modus tollens and say, well, hey, if theism is true, then at least one of these would be true, but none of them are true, so theism is false. So that's an interesting argument from Divine Providence. Actually, with regard to Molinism, I do want to shout out a recent paper that I need to read. It's by two excellent philosophers who I need to get on my channel. I might even have them on my channel to discuss this new argument against Molinism. It was just accepted like 2 weeks ago or something like that. So it's forthcoming. And published in the journal Mind, which is tied with Noose for the most prestigious and best philosophy journal in the entire world. It's by Nevin Kleiman-Haga and Daniel Rubio, and it's called Molinism: Explaining Our Freedom Away. So, and I think you can find this on Phil Papers, and I think they have a preprint version available for download in there. So I highly recommend checking it out. I'm just going to read the abstract. Molinists hold that there are contingently true counterfactuals about what agents would do if put in certain circumstances, such that God knows these prior to creation, and that God uses this knowledge in choosing how to create. In this essay, we critique Molinism, arguing that if these theses were true, agents would not be free. Consider Eve's sinning upon being tempted by a serpent. We argue that if Molinism is true, then there is some set of facts that fully explains both Eve's actions and everything else Eve does that influences that action. And that, if this is the case, Eve does not act freely. The first premise of this argument follows from the explanatory relations the Molinist is committed to, and the second premise follows from libertarian intuitions about free will. Definitely check that out, and, there are also... in the book, right, Divine Omniscience and Human Free Will, a Logical and Metaphysical Analysis, they go through Molinism and all other views and talk about the grounding objection and other sorts of things. Interestingly, the consequence argument is also going to be arguably an argument against Molinism. So if you have a principle to the effect that if P is true, and P strictly entails Q, and I don't have control over whether P is true, and I don't have control over whether or not P strictly entails Q, then I don't have control over Q, right? A lot of people think that that's plausible. If you have that kind of transfer of control principle, which is controversial, but a lot of people do think it's plausible, you're actually arguably not going to be able to be a Molinist, because even prior to you existing, there are these true counterfactuals of creaturely freedom about what you would do in all these various circumstances. Given that they are true, they strictly entail that you're going to be doing the things that they specify. Moreover, you don't have control over whether or not these things are true. After all, these things are true as God thinking about what world to create. Like, you don't even exist yet. And so you don't have control over whether these things are true. And moreover, you don't have control over the entailment relation between the truth of these things and the fact that you are going to do what you do. And so by that transfer of control principle, it follows that you don't have control over what you do. I'm not here to defend that argument against Molinism, but it's interesting, and people who are libertarians often use this kind of transfer of control principle against determinism. If I don't have control over, the specific actions of the particles bashing around in my brain, if I don't have control over that, and that strictly entails my doing some certain action, say, well then, because I don't have control over it, and because it strictly entails this other thing, I don't have control over that other thing, namely my action. So it's an argument that lots of libertarians themselves use, and they employ such intuitions often. But in that case, it seems equally to count against Molinism. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. There's the grounding problem and other sorts of things. Huge literature on this sort of stuff. But anyway, my point is just that, arguably, each of these views of divine providence is going to have some serious problems. And most people who defend such views recognize that there are problems. I think that could actually undergird a modus tollens argument against theism. So that would be interesting. Again, I don't claim that it's a decisive argument or anything. In fact, I'm not sure whether or not the argument, fully succeeds. After all, I'm an agnostic, right? I'm not an atheist, so obviously don't think that this argument successfully demonstrates its conclusion, but it certainly makes you reflect, and right now it provides some kind of evidential chip in my mind. But anyway, I'm just going on about certain philosophical and theological issues pertaining to these sorts of things. I talked about eternal conscious torment, incarnation, Trinity, divine providence, biblical genocide, and so on. So that's one thing, just certain theological and philosophical issues with Christianity and its commitments to these core versions of Christianity and its commitments to these sorts of things, like divine providence and eternal conscious torment, not all versions of Christianity. The second thing that I'll say is just that there are lots of arguments against theism more generally that I think are interesting and that weigh evidentially in my mind. You can see my video, Why Am I Agnostic, on this. You can see also Philippe Leon's list of over 100 such arguments on his blog. So, obviously I'm not claiming that they all succeed. My point is just that a lot of people have this myth that, there are only two arguments for atheism, the problem of evil and the problem of hiddenness, and the problem of hiddenness reduces to the problem of evil, so there's only one problem for theism. It's like, nope, Stop. The third thing that I want to say is that Catholicism still requires some form of divine simplicity, plus timelessness and impassibility and immutability, and I think many, though certainly not all, of the problems afflicting the stronger forms of divine simplicity equally afflict the weaker versions. So, for instance, contingency in God entails accidents in God, and that's debarred by most weaker forms of divine simplicity. And you can check out my video on arguments against classical theism for why this poses problems if you don't accept contingency in God. So look at the different modal collapse arguments, and in particular, some of the more interesting ones that I develop at the end about truth supervenes on being and predication arguments and truth making and other sorts of things. Really interesting stuff. Also, lots of arguments and problems for each of immutability and timelessness and impassibility, right? So it's not as though the problems are exhausted by divine simplicity. You can stay tuned for my arguments against classical theism parts 2 and 3, wherein I discuss and survey precisely such issues. And indeed, I'm not going to be defending all such arguments. Indeed, I'm going to be harshly criticizing many such arguments against classical theism. Stay tuned for that. When is that going to be posted? Well, hopefully part 2 in July or August at some point, maybe. I have no guarantees. So, Poklar asks, is there any chance you'd be willing to have Jeff Speaks to talk about his book, The Greatest Possible Being? It points out what seems to me a rather severe problem with ontological arguments. I definitely should get him on at some point, because, yes, that book has been widely reviewed, and it's nicely acclaimed and so on. So I've only read portions of it, but if I read the whole thing, I should definitely get Jeff Speaks on. This person also asks, what are your thoughts on Buddhism? Not many thoughts, though I do think selves probably exist, and to the extent that Buddhism requires a denial that there are selves, to that extent I think Buddhism is implausible. These noises are so frustrating. Stupid Facebook. What are your favorite novels? Okay, so novels. So I don't really read many, but I do love Brave New World. I like Lord of the Flies, and I also enjoyed And Then There Were None. James, are you planning to do videos on anything outside of philosophy of religion? Do you find time to read philosophy of language, political philosophy, etc.? Absolutely, I'm definitely going to be doing videos on such things. Now, I've already recorded many such videos, and haven't uploaded them yet. So one video on Platonism, the Objects of Science, with Dr. Scott Berman, and another video on atheistic Platonism with Eric Steinhardt, who wrote, more precisely, that book right there. Also, another video on substance dualism with Richard Swinburn. Also, a video on philosophy of time and hypertime with Sam Liebens and Ryan Mullins, and so on. I also plan on making videos on Bayes' theorem, and I also want to set up a discussion between Gillian Russell and Graham Priest to talk about logic and logical laws. I also want to have a discussion on philosophy of mind between David Papineau and a dualist of some kind, like maybe Thomas Bogardus, plus lots of other stuff in other areas of philosophy. And in terms of non-philosophy of religion content I've made a lot. Check out my video, Scientific Realism and Anti-Realism with Kane B. Check out my video on How Do You Know, on Skepticism and Epistemology with Andrew Moon. Check out my video, Moral Realism, or Moral Disagreement and Moral Realism. You can check out my What is Philosophy video. You can check out my Dialogue Across Ideological Barriers with John DeRosa. You can check out How to Discuss the Nature of Reality with Josh Rasmussen. You can check out Natural Law Theory and Sexuality with Dustin and Brian. You can check out my video, Paradoxes of Infinity, where I go through a bunch of different paradoxes, just for fun, without really talking much about theism in that. So, and so on, right? So I've done a lot of stuff on outside of philosophy of religion, and I plan to do much more as well. So, while also keeping philosophy of religion a fixed aspect of the channel too. James also asks, do you find engaging with notoriously difficult, that is, definitely not understandable, philosophers like the German idealists or the French postmodernists / post-structuralists worthwhile, or do you consider it a waste of time to read philosophers that do not lean towards clean premise-to-conclusion arguments at all? Given that 10 experts on Hegel and the like will interpret him in 14 different ways, do you think their work is substantial at all? So I think that there is probably going to be some value that you can, tease out of such thinkers. The question is whether or not the value outweighs the costs of the unclarity, the imprecision, the wishy-washiness, the fluff, all that sort of stuff. And that's probably, it's going to depend. It depends on whether or not you think that costs outweigh the benefits. So I myself don't study that sort of stuff. I don't think the costs outweigh the benefits, but I do recognize, yes, that there is value in what such thinkers can say. It's not as though I think it's all bunk and crap and, throw it to the flames. No, I think that there's certainly value in that. It's nice that there are scholars who are going through and teasing out some of the insights and, putting them in much clearer terms. But long story short, I myself don't really read any of that sort of stuff, like the French postmodernist, post-structuralist. I don't read. Jack X341 asks, do you believe in an afterlife or heaven? And so, no, I do not. I'm kind of agnostic on that sort of stuff. It derives from my agnosticism about God's existence. So, okay, that does it. That I went through all of them in a very long video, but I hope it's informative. Yeah, everyone, if you see value in the work that I do, consider becoming a patron or making a one-time donation. Yeah, it helps me not only pay my college debt and my student loans and other sorts of things like that. It also helps encourage me to make these videos where, I do it with care, caution, rigor, precision, love, and informed by the tip-top literature the cutting edge literature on these sort of things. I can keep producing this content for free for hundreds, if not thousands of people, and any support monetarily can help me keep this going for free. So, and also I choose not to run ads on my channel or anything like that because I hate ads myself, and so I want my viewers not to suffer through that. I'm here to serve you, right? And so if you see value in the work that I do, consider supporting me on Patreon or a one-time donation. So I do appreciate it. Thank you guys for the AMA again. Thank you for 3K, and much love to all of you. I'm Joe Schmid. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.